Welcome to Lotus Whisper, Zen Tales for Sleep. Tonight, we will explore a simple yet profound path to peace, a way to release the heavy stones we carry in our hearts without knowing how to set them down. It is a story about a young man named Kaito, whose mind was a stormy sea of unspoken words and unhealed sorrows. His journey takes him to a quiet mountain temple, where a wise master offers him not a sermon, but a blank page and a simple instruction to write it all down. This is a tale about the quiet power of giving form to our burdens and the gentle, liberating act of letting them go, watching them turn to smoke and ash, leaving behind only the clear, quiet sky of the present moment. Please subscribe to the channel to hear more stories like this. Part 1. The Weight of Unseen Stones. The night was a deep, silent ocean, and Kaito was adrift in its center. Outside his small wooden house, the village slept under a blanket of cool mountain air. The moon, a sliver of polished bone, cast long, soft shadows through the paper of his window screen, painting shifting patterns on the tatami mat. For everyone else, this quiet was a gift, a gentle passage into the world of dreams. For Kaito, it was a vast, empty room that amplified the noise within him. He lay on his sleeping futon, his eyes wide open, staring into the darkness of the ceiling. He had forgotten what it felt like for sleep to come easily, to be a friend that visited without invitation. Now it was a stranger he waited for, a guest who never arrived. His breath was a shallow tide, rising and falling, but it brought no peace. With every inhale, he felt a familiar weight settle upon his chest, a pressure that had no physical source. It was as if he had spent the day gathering heavy, smooth stones from a riverbed and placed them one by one upon his heart. He could not see them, could not touch them, but he felt their crushing presence in every moment. These were the stones of words left unspoken, of moments he wished he could reclaim, of a grief so profound it had become a part of his own architecture, a pillar holding up the roof of his sorrow. He turned onto his side, the simple cotton of his robe rustling with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. He tried to focus on the distant cry of a night bird, on the gentle whisper of the wind, moving through the pine trees that stood guard on the edge of the village. He tried to anchor his mind to these simple, present sounds, but his thoughts were like unruly currents, pulling him back into the churning waters of the past. A face would appear in his mind's eye, a smile he could no longer see in the waking world. A conversation would replay itself, but this time with the words he should have said, the comfort he should have offered. Each memory was another stone, and the weight grew until it was difficult to breathe. This heaviness was not confined to the night. It followed him into the dawn, a faithful shadow that clung to him even as the sun rose. Kaito was a woodcarver. His hands, once steady and sure, had created objects of delicate beauty. He could coax the spirit of a crane from a block of cherry wood, its wings poised for flight. He could carve the serene face of a bodhisattva into a piece of camphor, its expression a perfect embodiment of compassion. His work had been a form of meditation, a conversation between himself, the wood, and the sharp edge of his tools. The scent of cedar and pine in his workshop had been the scent of his own peace. But now, the workshop felt like a place of judgment. The tools on his bench seemed to mock the tremor in his hands. He would pick up a piece of wood, feeling its familiar grain, its potential. He would set his chisel to its surface, intending to make the first graceful cut, but his arm would not obey. A wave of exhaustion would wash over him, a profound lack of will. The connection between his mind's vision and his body's action was severed. The unseen stones on his heart were so heavy they seemed to pin his arms to his sides. Some days he would manage to work, but the results were stiff, lifeless. The cranes he carved looked earthbound, their necks tense, their wings heavy with an invisible burden. The faces he attempted were masks of sorrow, their eyes empty. His craft, which had once been a reflection of his inner stillness, was now a perfect mirror of his turmoil. He would look at a flawed piece, a crack in the wood where his hand had pushed too hard, a clumsy line where his focus had wavered, and he would see himself. He was that flawed piece of wood, full of cracks and clumsy lines. He began to spend more time just sitting in his workshop, surrounded by the ghosts of his former skill. The sunlight would stream through the window, illuminating the dancing dust motes in the air, each one a tiny world unto itself, and he would feel a profound separation from it all. He was a spectator to his own life, watching a man who looked like him fail to perform the simplest of tasks. The joy was gone. The focus was gone. All that remained was the weight. His interactions with the world became muted, as if he were listening through a thick wall of cotton. When he walked through the village to buy rice, the cheerful greetings of his neighbors felt like echoes from a distant shore. He would nod, perhaps offer a faint, fleeting smile, but his eyes would not meet theirs. He was afraid they would see the vast emptiness behind them. He was afraid they would ask him how he was, and he would not have the words to answer. Or worse, he would have too many. A flood that would sweep them both away. So he built a wall of silence around himself, a fortress to contain his own chaos. The taste of food had become dull, the vibrant colors of the market muted. He ate not for pleasure, but for sustenance, a mechanical act to keep the body moving. He would sit with his simple bowl of rice, pickled vegetables, chewing slowly, but the flavors would not register. It was as if the sorrow had coated his tongue, blinding his senses to any form of simple pleasure. The world was still offering its gifts, the warmth of the sun, the sweetness of a ripe persimmon, the laughter of children playing by the stream. But he was no longer able to receive them. His hands were too full, clutching the stones of his past. He would often find himself standing by the small river that flowed past the village. He would watch the water, how it moved effortlessly around the rocks in its path. It did not fight them, did not try to smash them. It simply yielded, flowed around, and continued on its way, its essence unchanged. He envied the water. His own mind was a river that had met a great dam, a blockage of his own making. The water of his life force was pooling, growing stagnant, unable to move forward. The pressure built and built, but there was no release. He tried to reason with his own mind. He would sit in the formal meditation posture he had been taught as a boy, focusing on his breath. Inhale, exhale. He would tell himself that the past was gone, that regret was a thief that stole the present. He knew these things intellectually. They were wise words he had heard many times. But they were like rain on a stone roof. They washed over the surface but never soaked in. The moment his concentration wavered, the thoughts would rush back in, a relentless tide of memory and self-reproach. His attempts at stillness only seemed to make the inner storm rage louder. Sometimes, a memory would surface that was not painful but gentle. The memory of his father's hands, calloused and kind, showing him how to hold a chisel for the first time. The memory of his mother's voice, singing a soft lullaby as she mended clothes by the evening lamp. These memories were almost worse than the painful ones. They were reminders of a light that was now extinguished, a warmth he could no longer feel. They were ghosts of a life that felt as if it had belonged to someone else, a story he had once read but could no longer find his place in. These moments of sweetness were tinged with the bitter taste of loss, and they would inevitably lead him back to the source of his grief. The event that had cleaved his life into a before and an after. His body began to carry the story of his mind. His shoulders were perpetually hunched, as if bracing for a blow. A knot of tension lived permanently between his shoulder blades. He would wake with his jaw clenched, his teeth aching from the unconscious strain of the night. He felt old, though he was still a young man. He walked with the slow, careful steps of someone carrying a fragile, heavy burden, afraid that a sudden movement might cause it all to come crashing down. One afternoon, as he sat listlessly in the market, not buying anything, just watching the flow of life around him, he overheard two elderly women talking, spoke in hushed, respectful tones about a place deep in the mountains, a small temple that clung to the side of a cliff like a hardy pine tree. They spoke of the master who lived there, a man named Ryokan. They did not speak of him as a miracle worker or a magician. They spoke of his quietness. They said the silence around him was so deep that you could hear the sound of a single leaf falling from a tree. They said he did not offer answers, but that in his presence, people often found their own. One of the women said her brother had gone to the temple, his heart heavy with a bitterness that had soured his life for years. He had returned a month later, and she said he was not a different man, but he was more himself than he had been in a long time. The bitterness was gone. In its place was a quiet acceptance, a lightness in his step. She said he described the master as being like an empty cup, utterly present, ready to receive whatever was offered without judgment. Kaito listened, his own heart a silent observer. The words were like a small seed falling onto the barren soil of his spirit. He had no faith in miracles. He had no expectation of a cure, but the idea of a place of profound quiet, a place where the noise of the world and the noise within himself might finally be subdued, was a sliver of light in his suffocating darkness. He did not imagine his stones would disappear, but perhaps, he thought, in a place of such stillness, he might learn how to carry them with a little more grace. He might learn how to breathe around their weight. That night, as he lay awake, the familiar pressure on his chest. He did not fight the memories. He simply watched them come and go. And amidst the swirling currents of his thoughts, the image of a mountain temple, perched high above the world, began to form. It was a place of mist and stone, of ancient trees and deep silence. The thought of the journey itself was daunting. His body felt weak, his spirit depleted. But for the first time in a very long time, a flicker of intention, a whisper of will stirred within him. It was not hope, not yet. It was something smaller, more fragile. It was the simple, quiet decision to move, to take one step, to walk toward the silence, in the faint, desperate belief that it might have something to offer him other than the echo of his own pain. The stones on his chest were still there, heavy as ever. But as he finally drifted into a shallow, fitful sleep, he imagined the feeling of a steep, rocky path beneath his feet. A path leading upward, away from the stagnant waters of his sorrow, and toward the unknown, clear air of the mountains. His sleep was not a refuge, but another landscape of his sorrow. In his dreams, he was not in his bed, but walking on the bottom of a deep, murky lake. The light from the surface was a distant, shimmering memory, too far to reach. The silence here was different from the silence of the night. It was a heavy, pressing silence that filled his ears and lungs. He moved in slow motion, his limbs leaden, and with every step, he would find another perfectly smooth, dark stone on the lake bed. He felt an inexplicable compulsion to pick them up. He would gather them in his arms, their cold weight a strange comfort, a solid reality in the wavering underwater world. He would hold them against his chest, his collection growing until he could barely move, until the weight of them began to push him deeper into the silt, the murky water closing over his head. He would always wake just before he was completely buried, his heart pounding against his ribs, the phantom weight of the dreamstones still pressing down on him. He rose with the first pale light of dawn, feeling not refreshed, but as if he had completed a long and arduous journey that led him right back to where he started. The dream clung to him like a damp cloak. He slid open the wooden door to his small home and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The mist was still settled in the valley, a soft white sea from which the dark green tops of the pine trees emerged like islands. In the past, this sight had filled him with a sense of clean, quiet possibility. Now, it just looked like the world was holding its breath, waiting. He went through the motions of his morning routine. He filled the iron kettle with water from the well, the rope cool and rough against his palms. He lit the small charcoal stove, coaxing the embers to life with a gentle breath. As he waited for the water to heat, he measured green tea leaves into a small earthenware pot. It was a pot he had made himself years ago. His thumbprint was still visible in the glaze near the rim, a permanent record of a moment of focused creation. Now, his own hands felt like strangers to him. He looked at them, at the calluses on his fingers and the fine network of lines on his palms. They were the hands of a craftsman, a maker, but they felt empty, useless. When the water was ready, he poured it over the leaves, the steam rising in a fragrant cloud. The scent of the tea, usually a source of simple, grounding pleasure, now carried with it a ghost. He remembered his father, sitting in this very spot, holding a similar cup. His father had taught him that preparing tea was a form of meditation. Pay attention to the water, the leaves, the heat, he would say. If your mind is here, with the tea, it cannot be lost somewhere else. For this moment, this is the whole universe. Kaito could hear the words as clearly as if his father were sitting beside him. But the teaching brought no comfort, only a fresh wave of grief. His mind was not with the tea. It was lost somewhere else, in a universe of memory from which he could not escape. He drank the tea, but it was just hot water. The universe in the cup was closed to him. Later that day, his supply of charcoal for the small forge where he shaped his carving tools ran locked. The thought of walking into the village, of facing the possibility of conversation, was exhausting. But the tools needed care, even if he could not bring himself to use them. The necessity of the task was a thin rope he could cling to. He put on his simple sandals and began the walk. The path was well worn, and his feet knew the way, but he kept his eyes down, studying the patterns of dust and stone, avoiding the gaze of those he passed. He saw a group of children chasing a dragonfly near the stream, their laughter like the chiming of small, clear bells. The sound did not warm him. It made him feel hollow, as if he were made of glass, and their joy was a bright light shining through him, revealing his own emptiness. He saw an old couple, walking hand in hand. their steps slow and synchronized by a lifetime of shared moments. They smiled at him, a gentle, knowing smile of elders for the young. Kaito managed a stiff nod in return, the muscles in his neck tight. He felt a profound sense of alienation, as if he were a visitor from another world, a world without laughter or shared warmth. As he approached the charcoal seller's shop, a voice called his name. "Kaito, it has been too long." It was Kenji, a potter from the other side of the village. Kenji was a man whose hands were always covered in clay, and whose face was usually creased in a broad, earthy smile. He stood there now, his smile as warm as ever. "I have not seen you at the market. Are you working on a special commission? Something that keeps you locked away?" Kaito's throat felt tight. He could feel the wall of silence rising within him. "No, just quiet work," he managed to say. The words felt like stones in his mouth. "Quiet work is good work," Kenji said, his eyes kind. But then his gaze sharpened slightly, with the perceptiveness of a fellow artisan. He noticed the slump in Kaito's shoulders, the lack of light in his eyes. "Are you well, my friend? You seem distant." The simple, honest question was like a physical blow. Kaito had no answer that was true and also bearable to speak. He could not say, "My heart is full of stones and I have forgotten how to carve." He could not say, "I am drowning in the silence of my own home." So he retreated further behind the wall. "I am fine, just tired." He quickly paid the charcoal seller, avoiding Kenji's concerned gaze. "I must go," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He turned and walked away, feeling the weight of Kenji's unspoken sympathy on his back. He had not only isolated himself, he was now actively pushing away the hands that reached out to him. Back in his workshop, the bag of charcoal felt impossibly heavy. He set it down, the sound echoing in the quiet space. The air was thick with the scent of wood shavings and old memories. He looked around at the unfinished pieces, at the tools lying dormant on his bench. His gaze fell upon a small carving he had started months ago, a simple figure of a sleeping fox, curled into a ball. It was meant to be a gift for a child in the village. It was nearly finished. All it needed were the fine details, the delicate etching of fur, the subtle curve of its peaceful expression. He picked up the carving and his finest chisel. He sat on his stool, his posture the same as it had been 1,000 times before. He brought the piece close, took a breath, and tried to place the tip of the chisel against the wood, but his hand began to tremble. It was not a slight tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable shaking. The chisel danced in his grip, a wild thing he could not tame. He tried to steady his right hand with his left, but it was no use. The shaking seemed to be coming from deep within his chest, from the very core of his being. Frustration and despair welled up inside him. With a choked cry, he pressed the tool against the wood, a desperate attempt to force his body into submission. The chisel slipped, gouging a deep, ugly scar across the fox's back, splintering the delicate grain. The sound of the wood cracking was sharp, final. He dropped the tool. It clattered onto the floor. He stared at the ruined carving. The sleeping fox was no longer peaceful. It was wounded, scarred by his own hand. And in that moment, the carving became a perfect symbol of himself. He too had been something whole, something with the potential for simple, quiet beauty. But his own mind, his own inability to let go, had carved a deep wound into his own being. He sat there for a long time, the silence of the workshop pressing in on him. The sun began to set, casting long orange rays of light through the window. The dust motes danced, indifferent. He looked at his trembling hands. These hands had once known the language of the wood. They had known how to listen to the grain, how to follow its story, how to release the form that was sleeping inside. Now, they only knew how to grip, how to hold on. They were clenched around the unseen stones, and there was no room for anything else. The image of the mountain temple returned to him, no longer a vague and misty notion, but a sharp, clear point of focus. The words of the old woman echoed in his mind. He did not offer answers, but in his presence, people often found their own. Kaito did not need answers from a wise man. He needed to find a way to unclench his own hands. The journey was no longer a choice, a faint possibility. It was a necessity. It was the only path he could see that did not lead to him sitting in this dusty, silent room forever, surrounded by the ghosts of what he used to be, holding a broken piece of his own life in his hands. He had to go. He had to walk. He had to carry his stones to the mountain, because he no longer had the strength to carry them here. The whispers of the mountain temple. Before the first rooster had even thought to clear its throat, Kaito was awake. He did not rise from a state of sleep, but from the gray, restless twilight that had become his nightly reality. This morning, however, was different. The familiar weight was still on his chest, but beneath it, a tiny, fragile current of purpose was flowing. He moved with a quiet deliberation that had been absent for months. He did not light a lamp, allowing the deep indigo of the pre-dawn to be his only guide. He gathered his few possessions: a spare cotton robe, 2 pairs of straw sandals, a small cloth bag filled with enough rice and dried plums to last a few days. He wrapped his remaining coins in a piece of cloth and tucked them deep inside his sleeve. From his workshop, he took only a small water gourd, leaving the rows of silent, accusing tools behind. Closing the door to his workshop was a quiet, final act. He did not look back at the unfinished carvings, at the wounded fox, at the life that had come to a standstill within those walls. He was leaving the tomb of his own making. He walked through the sleeping village, his footsteps muffled by the dusty path. The houses were dark, still shapes, each one holding a world of dreams he could no longer access. A dog barked once, a lonely sound that was quickly swallowed by the immense silence. He felt like a ghost, already departed from a world he had ceased to belong to. As he reached the edge of the village, where the forest began, he paused and looked back at the cluster of dark roofs, the place that had held all his joy and all his sorrow. He felt no nostalgia, no sadness at leaving. He felt only a vast emptiness and the quiet, urgent need to walk into the mountains that loomed before him, their peaks just beginning to separate themselves from the charcoal gray of the sky. The first part of the journey was deceptively easy. The path was a well-worn track used by woodcutters, winding through gentle foothills. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and the sweet decay of fallen leaves. But Kaito's body, softened by months of inertia and grief, protested with every step. His calves ached, and the simple pack on his back felt like it was filled with stones, a physical manifestation of the invisible ones he carried in his heart. His mind, too, was a treacherous companion. With every step, a chorus of doubts whispered in his ear. What are you doing? Walking into the wilderness on the rumor of a wise man. What can he do for you that you cannot do for yourself? You are a fool, chasing the wind. You will find nothing on that mountain but cold and exhaustion. You should turn back. At least in your own home, your misery is familiar. He tried to ignore the voices, focusing instead on the rhythm of his own breathing, on the sensation of his feet meeting the earth. Left foot, right foot, inhale, exhale. But the thoughts were persistent. The path began to climb, and the gentle slope steepened into a series of rugged switchbacks. The trees grew taller, their ancient trunks thick with moss. The sunlight, now breaking over the horizon, struggled to pierce the dense canopy, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. The world grew quieter. The familiar sounds of the village were gone, replaced by the call of unknown birds and the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth. The physical exertion began to have a strange effect on him. The burning in his legs and the ache in his shoulders became so loud that they started to drown out the whispers of his mind. He no longer had the energy for regret or speculation. All his focus narrowed to the immediate, demanding present. This slippery root, this loose stone, this steep incline that required him to use his hands to pull himself up. His breath came in ragged gasps. But for the first time in a very long time, he was breathing fully, using his entire lungs. He was no longer thinking about his sorrow. He was simply trying to survive the next step. By midday, he stopped by a small, clear stream that tumbled over mossy rocks. His hands trembled as he untied the gourd from his pack. He drank deeply, the water so cold it made his teeth ache. It was the most real thing he had felt in months. He sat on a rock, the dampness seeping through his robe, and ate a single rice ball. He chewed slowly, methodically. The simple taste of salted rice was not dull or muted. It was a vibrant explosion of flavor on his tongue, a taste he had earned through sweat and effort. He looked at his surroundings with new eyes. He saw the delicate, intricate patterns of a fern unfurling. He noticed the way the light caught the spray from the stream, creating 1,000 tiny fleeting rainbows. The world was not gray. It had never been gray. It was he who had been looking at it through a veil of smoke. He continued his ascent. The path grew fainter, in places disappearing altogether, forcing him to navigate by the position of the sun and the general upward slope of the mountain. The air grew thinner, cleaner. He felt a profound sense of isolation, but it was no longer the suffocating isolation of his workshop. This was a clean, vast solitude. He was a single small being in an immense living world. His personal sorrows, which had seemed so monumental in the village, began to feel smaller here, put into perspective by the sheer scale of the ancient trees and the silent, unyielding stone. Late in the afternoon, the sky began to darken. The air grew heavy and still. A low rumble echoed through the valleys, a sound that seemed to come from the very bones of the mountain. The wind began to rise, not as a gentle whisper, but as a mournful howl through the high branches. A storm was coming. Kaito looked for shelter, his heart beginning to pound with a new kind of anxiety, a primal fear that was clean and simple compared to the tangled knots of his grief. He spotted a shallow overhang, a place where a giant boulder leaned against the mountainside, creating a small dry space beneath it. He scrambled inside just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The rain came down in a solid, gray sheet, turning the world outside his small cave into a blur of motion and sound. The drumming on the rock above his head was deafening. Lightning flashed, illuminating the forest in stark, momentary tableaus of silver and black, followed by cracks of thunder that shook the ground beneath him. He huddled in the back of the small space, shivering from a combination of cold and fear. There was nothing he could do. He could not run, could not fight. He could only wait. And so he sat. He watched the rain. He listened to the thunder. He felt the cold seep into his bones. The storm raged for what felt like an eternity. In its fury, there was a strange kind of peace, The storm was so powerful, so absolute, that it demanded his complete attention. There was no room for memories, no space for regret. There was only the roar of the wind and the relentless percussion of the rain. His own inner storm, for a time, was silenced by the greater storm of the world. He was not Kaito, the grieving son, not Kaito, the failed artisan. He was just a small, cold creature, waiting for the rain to stop. He must have drifted into a state of exhausted waking sleep because he was startled when he realized the sound had changed. The violent drumming had softened to a steady, gentle patter. The thunder had moved off into the distance, now just a faint grumble. He peered out from his shelter. The world was dripping, washed clean. The air was thick with the rich scent of wet earth and pine. A single shaft of late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, striking a patch of moss on a nearby tree and making it glow with an almost supernatural intensity. He felt a profound sense of gratitude, so sharp and unexpected it brought tears to his eyes. It was gratitude for the simple fact of being dry, of being safe, of the storm having passed. It was a feeling that had no complex thoughts attached to it. It was pure, simple, and it filled the hollow space inside him for a brief, wondrous moment. He spent the night in that small shelter. He did not have a fire, and the cold was a constant companion. But his sleep, when it finally came, was deep and dreamless for the first time in over a year. It was the sleep of a body that had been pushed to its absolute limit, a mind that had been scoured clean by effort and awe. He woke the next morning, feeling stiff and sore, but also strangely light. The climb was even steeper now. He was above the thickest part of the forest, on a rocky spine of the mountain. Small, hardy pine trees, twisted by the wind, clung to the rock. The views were breathtaking. He could see the whole world spread out below him, the valley still filled with a sea of white mist. He felt as if he were walking on the roof of the world. He began to hear it in the late morning, a faint, rhythmic sound carried on the wind. Thump, thump, thump. It was a steady, patient sound, the sound of an axe splitting wood. It was a human sound, a sound of purpose. It was a beacon. And he walked toward it, his steps finding a new energy. The path curved around a massive shoulder of rock, and suddenly there it was. The temple was not grand or imposing. It seemed to grow out of the mountain itself. Its wooden beams were the color of weathered stone, its gracefully curved roof the color of the pine needles that covered it. It clung to the cliffside, a testament to patience and balance. A thin curl of smoke rose from a chimney, a silent invitation. The air here was different. It was still, but it was a vibrant, living stillness. It was the silence he had heard about, a silence so deep you could hear a leaf fall. As he approached the simple wooden gate, he saw a figure inside the small, raked courtyard. It was a young monk, his head shaved, his brown robe simple and clean. He was sweeping fallen pine needles with a bamboo broom. Kaito stopped, hidden by the gatepost, and watched. The monk's movements were not hurried. They were fluid, economical, and full of a profound concentration. Each sweep of the broom was a complete and perfect action. He was not merely cleaning the courtyard. He was engaged in a deep and intimate conversation with the ground, the needles, and the broom. His entire being was focused on this one simple task. There was no tension in his shoulders, no distraction in his eyes. He was the embodiment of peace in motion. Kaito stood there, his own body aching and filthy from the journey. His robes were torn, his face was scratched, his mind was a jumble of exhaustion and apprehension. He looked at the monk, at his effortless presence, and he felt the full crushing weight of his own inner chaos. He had carried his unseen stones all this way, up this impossibly steep mountain. He had endured the trail, the storm, the hunger, and the fear, and now he was here at the threshold. He had arrived. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the thin mountain air burning in his lungs, and took the final, hesitant step through the temple gate. As Kaito's straw sandals scuffed against the gravel of the courtyard, the young monk paused his sweeping. He did not startle or look up with surprise. He simply stopped his motion, the broom held lightly in his hands, and slowly raised his head. His face was calm, his expression unreadable but not unkind. His eyes, clear and deep, met Kaito's. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the sighing of the wind through the ancient pines that stood sentinel around the temple. In that silence, Kaito felt utterly exposed. It was as if the monk's quiet gaze could see right through his torn robes and travel-worn exterior, directly into the tangled mess of his heart. He saw the grief, the regret, the exhaustion, the shame of his abandoned craft. Kaito felt a sudden, powerful urge to turn and flee back down the mountain, back to the familiar misery he knew how to navigate. The peace of this place felt like a brilliant light that made his own darkness seem even more profound and unbearable. He opened his mouth to speak, to explain his presence, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? "I'm broken and have come here to be fixed. My mind is a storm, and I heard this was a place of quiet." It all sounded foolish, a desperate plea from a drowning man. He felt his hands clench into fists at his sides, his knuckles white. The young monk seemed to sense his turmoil. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow, a gesture of simple acknowledgement. "Welcome," he said. His voice was not what Kaito expected. It was not a solemn, ethereal whisper. It was a normal voice, calm and clear, like the water in the mountain stream. "The path is steep. You must be tired. Please, come." He gestured with the broom toward the main temple building, a simple, elegant structure of dark wood and paper screens. The invitation was so simple, so devoid of judgment or questioning, that it disarmed Kaito completely. He had braced himself for interrogation, for a test of his sincerity, for the possibility of being turned away. Instead, he was met with a quiet, unassuming hospitality. The tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction. He managed a clumsy bow in return and followed the monk across the raked gravel, his own heavy, uneven footsteps a stark contrast to the monk's light, balanced tread. They left their sandals at the edge of the polished wooden veranda and stepped inside. The interior of the temple was even simpler than the outside. The floors were dark, smooth wood, worn to a soft sheen by centuries of stockinged feet. The walls were plain paper screens, filtering the mountain light into a soft, diffused glow. There was no ornate statuary, no gilded altars. The only decoration was a single, masterful stroke of calligraphy on a hanging scroll, a character Kaito did not recognize, but which seemed to hold a universe of meaning in its bold, fluid lines. The air inside was cool and smelled faintly of old wood, tatami, and the clean, subtle scent of incense. The silence here was different from the silence outside. It was a heavy, ancient silence, a silence that felt curated and protected. It was the silence of countless hours of meditation, of unspoken teachings passed from master to student. It seemed to absorb sound, to soften the edges of the world. Kaito found himself breathing more slowly, more quietly, as if not to disturb the profound stillness of the space. The monk led him through a short corridor to a small, simple room, A low wooden table sat in the center of the tatami mats. "Please, rest here," the monk said. "I will bring you some tea." He bowed again and slid the paper door shut, leaving Kaito alone. Kaito knelt by the table, his body protesting with a chorus of aches and pains. He looked around the room. It was utterly bare save for the table. The stark emptiness should have felt cold or unwelcoming, but instead it felt calming. There was nothing to distract the eye, nothing to clutter the mind. It was a room that invited you to simply be present. He realized how cluttered his own home was, not just with his tools and carvings, but with the invisible clutter of his memories, each object a hook for a thought, a trigger for a feeling. Here, there were no hooks. There was only the empty space, the soft light, and the deep, resonant silence. The paper door slid open, and the monk returned, carrying a small black lacquer tray. On it was a simple iron teapot and a single rustic-looking ceramic cup. He knelt opposite Kaito and poured the tea. The liquid was a pale golden green. The steam rose in a delicate wisp. The monk pushed the cup across the table toward Kaito. "My name is Soko," the monk said. "You have come to see Master Ryokan." It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Kaito nodded, his throat still tight. He reached for the cup, his hand still trembling slightly. He wrapped his fingers around its warmth, a small, solid anchor in the vast quiet. "Yes," he whispered, I heard he was a wise man." Soko smiled, a faint, gentle expression that barely disturbed the calm of his face. "The master is just an old man who has learned to sit still," he said. "Wisdom is like the mountain. It is here for anyone who is willing to make the climb, but the mountain does not offer you its wisdom. You find your own by walking the path." Kaito took a sip of the tea. It was delicate, with a slightly bitter, grassy flavor that was both refreshing and grounding. The warmth spread through his chest, and he felt another layer of tension begin to dissolve. He looked at Soko, at his shaved head and his simple robes, and wondered at his age. He could have been 20 or 40. His face was smooth, but his eyes held a depth that spoke of a much older soul. "The master is in meditation," Soko continued. "He will see you when he is finished. It may be some time. You should rest. There is a room where you can sleep. You can wash at the well behind the kitchen." The offer of rest, of a place to sleep and wash, was a gift of such profound simplicity that Kaito felt a lump form in his throat. He had expected to have to prove himself, to beg for an audience. He had been so focused on the meeting with the master that he had not even considered the basic human needs of his own exhausted body. Soko seemed to understand. He stood, his movements graceful and unhurried. "The body carries the mind," he said softly. "When the body is tired, the mind cannot be clear. Rest first. The master is not going anywhere." He showed Kaito to a small cell-like room, no bigger than his own back at the village, but containing only a neatly folded futon and a single blanket. It was clean, spare, and deeply peaceful. After Soko left, Kaito stood in the middle of the room for a long time. He felt a sense of unreality, as if he had stepped out of his own life and into a story. The journey, storm, the arrival, the quiet monk. It all felt like a dream, but the ache in his muscles was real. The weariness that pulled at his eyelids was real. He followed Soko's directions to the well. Behind the main building was a small, practical area with a woodshed, a vegetable garden, and a stone well. The water he drew was shockingly cold. He stripped off his filthy outer robe and washed himself, the icy water a jolt to his system, washing away not just the dirt and sweat of the trail, but also some of the mental fog that had clouded his thoughts for so long. As he stood there, clean and shivering in the cool mountain air, he felt more present, more alive than he had in years. He was just a man, standing by a well, feeling the cold water on his skin. It was a simple, uncomplicated reality, and it was a profound relief. He had made it. He was here, and for now, that was enough. Part 3. An empty cup and a blank page. Kaito slept. It was not the shallow, troubled sleep of his nights in the village, nor the exhausted oblivion of his night on the mountain. This was something else entirely. It was a deep, quiet sinking into darkness, a complete surrender. The spare, empty room seemed to hold him in a gentle embrace, its silence a balm for his frayed nerves. The simple futon, thin and firm, supported his aching body perfectly. There were no dreams, no ghosts, no stones. There was only the profound peace of non-being, a blessed emptiness that lasted for an unknown stretch of time. He was awakened not by a sound, but by a change in the quality of the light. He opened his eyes to find the room bathed in the soft gray glow of an overcast afternoon. He felt a deep sense of dislocation, unsure for a moment of where he was. Then the memory of the journey, the temple, the quiet monk Soko returned to him. He sat up, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, the familiar weight on his chest was not the first thing he noticed. It was still there, a low background hum of sorrow, but it was not the crushing presence it had once been. His body felt sore, but it was the clean, honest soreness of exertion, not the dull ache of despair. He dressed in his spare robe, which felt impossibly clean and light against his skin. He folded the futon and blanket with a care he had not felt for any task in a long time, placing them neatly in the corner of the room, just as he had found them. The simple act of creating order in his small space felt meaningful, a quiet echo of the order he sought for his own mind. When he slid open the paper door, Soko was there, as if he had been waiting. He was not looking at the door, but was standing a short distance away, gazing out at the mountains, which were now wreathed in slow-moving clouds of mist. He turned his head as Kaito emerged, his expression as serene as ever. "You slept well," Soko observed gently. "I did," Kaito said, the words surprising him with their simple truth. "The master is ready to see you now," Soko said. "He is in the tea room." A jolt of nervous energy shot through Kaito, a sudden return of the anxiety that had driven him up the mountain. The rest had cleared his body, but now his mind began to churn again. What would he say? How could he possibly explain the tangled knot of his suffering to a man he had never met? He felt his hands begin to grow clammy. He followed Soko along the polished wooden corridor, his own footsteps suddenly seeming loud and clumsy again. The profound silence of the temple, which had been a comfort just moments before, now felt like a vast, expectant stage upon which he was about to perform. Soko stopped before a set of paper screens that were slightly ajar. He bowed to Kaito. "He is waiting." Then, with a quiet grace, Soko turned and walked away, leaving Kaito alone before the door. Kaito's heart was pounding. He took a deep breath, the cool, incense-scented air doing little to calm him. He felt like a child about to confess a transgression to a stern father. He raised a trembling hand and gently pushed the screen open, stepping inside. The room was small, even smaller than the one he had slept in. The air was warm and filled with the scent of brewing tea and a faint, smoky fragrance from a small charcoal brazier in the corner, where a heavy iron kettle whispered and steamed. The light was soft, filtered through a single window that looked out not onto the grand vista of the mountains, but onto a tiny enclosed garden. The garden was a masterpiece of simplicity. A single gnarled pine tree, a few artfully placed stones covered in moss, and a patch of raked white sand. It was a whole universe in a space no bigger than a farmer's cart. Seated on a cushion before the brazier was an old man. He was small, almost frail, and his head was as smooth and shaved as Soko's. His robes were a deep dark blue, the color of the evening sky. His back was to Kaito, and he did not turn or acknowledge his entrance. He was completely absorbed in the preparation of tea, his movements slow, deliberate, and imbued with an almost unearthly grace. His hands were wrinkled and liver-spotted, the hands of a very old man, yet they moved with the sureness and precision of a master craftsman. Kaito stood frozen just inside the doorway, unsure of what to do. Should he speak? Should he bow? Should he just wait? He felt a wave of shame at his own awkwardness, his own noisy intrusion into this sanctuary of peace. He chose to wait, trying to make himself as small and quiet as possible. He watched as the old man, who he knew must be Master Ryokan, used a bamboo ladle to transfer hot water from the kettle to a small dark brown bowl. He then took a small whisk, also made of bamboo, and began to whip the powdered green tea and water together. The sound of the whisk against the ceramic was the only sound in the room, a soft, rhythmic scratching. It was a sound of pure focus. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a minute, the master stopped. He lifted the whisk, and the tea in the bowl was a perfect, frothy jade green. He placed the bowl on the tatami mat, then turned his head and looked at Kaito for the first time. His face was a landscape of wrinkles, a map of a long life lived with deep attention. But his eyes were extraordinary. They were not the sharp, piercing eyes of a judge, nor the distant, ethereal eyes of a saint. They were clear, calm, and deeply, shockingly present. They held a hint of gentle amusement, as if he were looking at a beloved, slightly clumsy grandchild. There was no judgment in them, no expectation. They were like the empty room Kaito had slept in, a quiet, open space. "You have come a long way," Ryokan said. His voice was like his eyes, calm and quiet, with a low, gravelly timbre, like stones rolling in a slow river. "Your feet must be sore. Come, sit, have some tea." He gestured to the cushion opposite him. Kaito, feeling a strange sense of relief wash over him, moved quietly to the indicated spot and knelt, bowing his head deeply. When he looked up, Ryokan was pushing the bowl of tea toward him. "Drink," the master said. Kaito picked up the bowl with both hands, as he had been taught as a boy. It was warm, the ceramic rough and pleasing to the touch. He brought it to his lips and drank. The tea was thick, slightly bitter, but with a deep, lingering sweetness. It was unlike any tea he had ever tasted. It felt nourishing, alive. It seemed to calm the frantic beating of his heart from the inside out. He drank it all, then placed the empty bowl back on the mat between them. Ryokan nodded, a small, satisfied smile touching the corners of his lips. "An empty cup is a useful cup," he said, his voice soft. He then reached beside him and produced something Kaito had not noticed before. It was a stack of clean white paper, a small, dark inkstone, a stick of black ink, and a simple bamboo-handled brush. He placed these items on the mat next to the empty tea bowl. Kaito stared at them confused. He was a woodcarver, not a scholar. His hands knew the chisel and the mallet, not the delicate dance of the brush. He looked up at the master, his brow furrowed in a silent question. Ryokan's gaze was steady, patient. "You have come here with a full heart," he said. "It is so full, there is no room for anything else. It is like a cup that is already filled to the brim with stale, bitter tea. If I were to pour fresh, clean tea into it, it would only overflow and be wasted. First, you must empty your cup." He gestured to the paper and the brush. "Your mind is full of stories," he continued. "Stories of what happened. Stories of what you should have done. Stories of your pain. These stories are the unseen stones you carry. They are heavy because they have no place to go. You keep them inside, and you turn them over and over, polishing them with your sorrow." He picked up the brush and dipped it into the inkstone, where a small pool of water waited. He began to grind the ink stick against the stone, a slow, circular motion. The room filled with the clean, earthy smell of the ink. "I want you to take these," he said, his eyes never leaving Kaito's. "I want you to find a quiet place, and I want you to write. Write down every story, every memory that haunts you, every word you wish you had said, every feeling that weighs upon your heart. Do not try to make it beautiful. Do not worry about grammar or style. This is not for anyone else to read. This is for you. Pour all the bitter tea from your mind onto the paper. Do not stop until there is nothing left to say. Fill the pages with your river of sorrow." Kaito was stunned into silence. This was not what he had expected. He had anticipated questions, philosophical discourse, perhaps a riddle or a koan to meditate on. He had prepared himself to try and articulate his pain, to put his chaotic feelings into some kind of coherent narrative for the master to analyze and solve. But Ryokan was not asking for his story. He was asking him to give it to the paper instead. "But I am not a writer," Kaito stammered, the words feeling inadequate as soon as they left his lips. "My hands, they are for carving." Ryokan stopped grinding the ink. He looked at Kaito's hands, which were resting, clenched on his knees. "The hand that can guide a chisel can guide a brush," he said simply. "The tool is not important. The intention is. Your intention is not to create art. Your intention is to empty yourself. Think of the paper as a block of wood, and your sorrow as the excess that must be carved away to find the form that lies sleeping within. Right now, the form is peace. You must carve away the grief to find it." He pushed the stack of paper, the inkstone, and the brush across the mat to Kaito. "There is an empty room at the end of the corridor. It has a table and a window that looks out onto the eastern mountains. No one will disturb you. Take as long as you need. Days, weeks, it does not matter. The mountain is patient." Kaito looked down at the blank white pages. They seemed vast, intimidating. How could he possibly contain the ocean of his grief in these small, fragile sheets? The prospect was overwhelming. His first instinct was to refuse, to say that this was not what he came for, that he needed guidance, answers, wisdom. He wanted the master to lift the stones for him, but Ryokan was offering him a tool to lift them himself. He looked up again at the old man's face. The master's expression was one of complete, unwavering calm. It was a calm that did not demand anything, but simply offered a space for Kaito to be as he was. There was a profound wisdom in the master's silence, a trust that Kaito found both terrifying and deeply comforting. Ryokan was not offering him a cure. He was offering him a
process. He was not giving him a fish, he was handing him a fishing pole and pointing to the turbulent waters of his own heart. A part of Kaito resisted. It was the part of him that had grown accustomed to the weight, the part that defined itself by its sorrow. To write it all down felt like a betrayal of his grief, a dilution of its power. If he emptied it out, what would be left of him? The fear of that emptiness was as great as the pain of his fullness. But then he remembered the feeling of the empty cup in his hands, the clean, satisfying finality of it. He remembered the empty room where he had slept so deeply. He looked at the master, whose entire being seemed to be an embodiment of that useful emptiness. Perhaps emptiness was not a void to be feared, but a space to be filled with something new. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and gathered the paper, the inkstone, and the brush. The materials felt foreign in his hands, but also solid, real. He held them to his chest. He bowed his head to the master, a deep, long bow of acceptance. He did not need to speak. When he looked up, Ryokan was nodding, his eyes full of a quiet, compassionate understanding. "Go now," he said, his voice a gentle dismissal. "The page is listening. It has no judgment. It will not turn away." Kaito stood, clutching the tools of his new, strange task. He bowed one last time and backed out of the room, sliding the screen shut. He stood in the silent corridor, his heart a confusing mix of terror and a fragile, unfamiliar flicker of hope. He had come to the mountain seeking answers from a wise man. Instead, he had been given an empty cup, a blank page, and an invitation to face himself. As he walked down the corridor, Kaito's mind reeled. The master's instructions were so simple, yet they felt like the most difficult task he had ever been given. It was one thing to be haunted by the past in the privacy of his own mind, where memories could remain vague, shifting shapes in the dark. It was another thing entirely to drag them into the light, to give them a fixed, undeniable form in black ink on a white page. To write them down was to admit their reality, to face them without the buffer of distraction or the mercy of forgetfulness. He found the room Ryokan had described. It was at the far end of the temple, overlooking the steep eastern face of the mountain. Like the others, it was spare and clean. A low writing desk stood beneath a wide open window, through which a cool, mist-laden breeze flowed, carrying the scent of pine and wet stone. He could see nothing but a vast expanse of gray cloud, a formless, moving sea that concealed the world below. The room felt like it was floating, untethered from the earth, a silent perch at the edge of the world. He knelt at the desk, the wood smooth and cool beneath his forearms. He arranged the tools before him, the stack of paper, a pristine white mountain of its own, the heavy, dark inkstone, the solid stick of ink, the slender brush. For a long time, he just sat there, looking at them. They were objects of potential, silent and waiting. The paper was a perfect, untouched silence. To make a mark upon it felt like a violation, a shouting in a quiet room. His anxiety returned, coiling in his stomach. The doubts began their insidious whisper again. What's the point of this? Reliving every painful moment will only make it worse. You are just indulging your own misery. This is a pointless exercise. He felt a familiar paralysis creep into his limbs, the same inertia that had kept him sitting uselessly in his workshop for months. His hand, resting near the brush, felt heavy, disconnected from his will. He looked out the window at the shifting mist. It moved without effort, constantly changing its form, obscuring and revealing the dark rock of the cliff face. It held no shape, yet it was a powerful presence. His own thoughts and feelings were like that mist, he realized. They were formless, constantly swirling, obscuring the solid reality of the present moment. Perhaps giving them form on the page was not about making them more real, but about separating them from himself. To see them written down would be to see that they were objects like stones or trees. They were things that existed, but they were not him. He was the one who was observing them. This small shift in perspective was like a key turning in a rusty lock. He was not his grief. He was the one who was experiencing grief. He was not his regret. He was the one who was experiencing regret. The distinction was subtle, but it felt profound. With a newfound, albeit shaky resolve, he picked up the inkstick. He poured a small amount of water from a nearby pitcher into the well of the inkstone. He began to grind the ink, just as he had watched the master do. He tried to emulate Ryokan's slow, meditative rhythm. The circular motion was calming. The faint, scraping sound was a focus point in the immense silence. The earthy fragrance of the ink began to fill the small space. He focused entirely on this task. The feeling of the stick in his hand, the changing consistency of the ink as it thickened, the deep, lustrous blackness that was emerging from the solid gray stone. For these few moments, he was not thinking about his past or his pain. He was just a man making ink. It was a simple, grounding act, a preparation not just of his tools, but of his mind. When the ink was the consistency of dark honey, he stopped. He picked up the brush. The bamboo shaft felt light and balanced in his fingers, but the soft tip of the bristles seemed to possess a terrifying will of its own. He dipped it into the ink, watching the white hairs drink up the blackness. He held the brush poised over the first sheet of paper. His mind went blank. The vast, churning ocean of his sorrow suddenly became a calm, empty desert. He couldn't think of a single thing to write. All the memories, all the words that had tormented him for months, vanished. There was only the white page and the black-tipped brush. The silence in the room deepened, pressing in on him. He felt a surge of panic. He was failing already. He couldn't even begin. He closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, feeling the cool mountain air fill his lungs. He let it out slowly. "The page is listening," Ryokan had said. "It has no judgment." He did not have to perform. He did not have to be eloquent. He just had to begin. He thought of the first stone, the heaviest one, the one at the very bottom of the pile on his heart, the memory he had pushed away more than any other. He let the image form in his mind, not fighting it, not flinching from it. He saw his father's face, pale and still on the sleeping futon. He saw the morning light streaming into the room, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, a beautiful, ordinary morning for an extraordinarily terrible event. His hand began to shake again, the same tremor that had ruined the carving of the fox. But this time he did not fight it. He let it shake. He lowered the brush to the paper, and with a clumsy, unsteady hand, he made the first mark. It was not an elegant character. It was a jagged, spidery line, a black scar on the perfect white. But it was a beginning. He wrote his father's name, and as he formed the characters of that beloved name, the dam broke. Part 4. The River of Ink. The two characters of his father's name, stark and black on the white paper, were not just symbols. They were a key,
turning a lock deep inside him, and the door they opened did not creak open slowly. It was blasted from its hinges by a force of memory so powerful, it stole the air from his lungs. The quiet, misty room vanished. He was back in his own home, a year ago, on a morning that had begun like any other. The ink on his brush was no longer just ink. It was the shadowy light of that dawn. The white paper was the pale, still face of his father. His hand, no longer his own, moved across the page, the brush a frantic, desperate narrator. He wrote of the silence, the terrible, unnatural silence of a house where there should have been the sound of a man rising, coughing, preparing the morning tea. He wrote of the cold dread that had pooled in his stomach as he walked to his father's room, of the way he had called his name once, twice, his voice sounding thin and childish. He wrote of sliding open the paper screen and seeing the still form on the futon. He described the way the morning light had fallen across the blanket, how it had seemed so peaceful, so ordinary, that for a moment his heart had unclenched. He wrote the words, "He is just sleeping deeply." He wrote them over and over, as if trying to convince the paper, to convince the past itself. Then came the description of touching his father's hand, the shocking, profound cold of it. A cold that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was a cold that had leached into his own bones and had lived there ever since. Tears began to stream down Kaito's face, hot and silent. They dripped from his chin onto the page, making the wet ink bleed and feather at the edges, turning sharp characters into soft gray blurs. He did not wipe them away. They were part of the story. They were the water in this river of ink. The first page was filled, a chaotic scrawl of black and gray. He did not pause. He pushed it aside, the wet ink smearing on the desk, and pulled a fresh sheet toward him. The dam was broken, and the flood was immense. Now came the memories that had circled his grief like hungry wolves. The argument. It had been 3 days before his father's passing, a stupid, meaningless argument over a piece of Zelkova wood. Kaito had wanted to use it for a sculpture of a dragon, a dynamic, powerful piece. His father, in his quiet way, had suggested the wood's grain was too gentle for a dragon. "It wants to be something still," he had said. "Listen to the wood, Kaito. It will tell you what it wants to be." Kaito, full of a young man's pride and ambition, had heard this as criticism. He had accused his father of being too conservative, too bound by tradition. Harsh words had been spoken. He had seen a flash of hurt in his father's eyes. Before the old man had simply turned and walked away. They had not spoken of it again. They had been polite, distant for those final days, the unspoken apology a heavy stone between them. Now, on the paper, Kaito wrote the words he should have said. "You were right. I was a fool. I am sorry. Please forgive me." The brush dug into the paper, the characters fierce, jagged with the force of his regret. He filled page after page. He wrote about his childhood, about his father's calloused hands guiding his own small ones as they held a chisel for the first time. He described the scent of cedar shavings, the patient sound of his father's voice, explaining the soul of the wood. These memories, once so sweet, were now agonizing. Each one was a testament to what he had lost. He wrote, not in chronological order, but as the memory surfaced, a turbulent, churning torrent, a forgotten lullaby his mother used to sing, the taste of a sweet rice cake shared at a summer festival, the pride on his father's face when Kaito had sold his first carving.
He lost all track of time. The gray light in the room softened, warmed to a gentle gold, then deepened to the orange and purple of sunset. He did not notice. His world had shrunk to the small space of the desk, to the endless journey from the inkstone to the paper. His back began to ache, a fierce knot of pain between his shoulder blades. His hand cramped, his fingers locking around the brush in a claw-like grip. He barely felt it. The pain of the body was a distant echo of the pain he was pouring onto the pages. At some point, the paper door slid open. He was vaguely aware of a presence, of a tray being placed silently on the tatami mat beside him. He did not look up. His eyes were fixed on the character he was forming, a character for the word empty. The emptiness of his father's chair, the emptiness of the workshop without his quiet presence, the emptiness in his own chest. He heard the door slide shut. Much later, when his hand was shaking so badly he could no longer form a coherent line, he stopped, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He looked over and saw the tray. On it was a bowl of simple rice porridge, some pickled radish, and a pot of fresh tea. It was Soko. The food was still warm. How long had it been there? He forced himself to eat. His throat was raw, and it was difficult to swallow. But as he ate the warm, plain porridge, he felt a flicker of gratitude for the silent, unobtrusive care. The monks were not trying to solve his problem. They were simply creating a space for him to do the work and sustaining his body while he did it. He drank the tea, its warmth spreading through his chilled body. He looked at the pile of ink-soaked pages beside him. There were dozens. It was a mountain of sorrow made tangible. And yet, he was not finished. The river was still flowing. He rested for only a few moments before turning back to the desk. The sun had set, and the room was filled with a deep, velvety darkness, broken only by the faint starlight from the window. Soko had left a small oil lamp, its flame a single, steady point of light in the vast dark. Kaito lit the lamp. The flame cast his hunched shadow, large and distorted, against the paper wall. The night brought a different kind of memory. In the darkness, the fears and the deeper, more formless sorrows emerged. He wrote about his fear of forgetting his father's voice. He wrote about the guilt of feeling a moment of happiness in the months after the death, the feeling that he was betraying his own grief. He wrote about his anger at his father for leaving him, anger at the gods, at the universe for its casual cruelty, anger at himself for being so weak, for allowing his grief to destroy his art, his life. He wrote about the wood. He confessed to the paper his terror that his skill was not his own, that it had been a gift from his father, and that with his father's death, the gift had been taken back. He described the lifelessness he felt when he held his tools, the silence of the wood that would no longer speak to him. He was not just a grieving son. He was a craftsman who had lost his craft, an artist who had lost his muse. He had lost not just his past, but his future as well. The ink ran low. He would stop, his movements now automatic, and grind more. The rhythmic circular motion was the only pause in the frantic flow of words. He would dip the brush, and the river would begin to move again. His robes were stained with ink. His fingers were black. The desk was a mess of smeared characters and tear-blotched paper. The room was filled
with the rustling of the pages, the scratching of the brush, and the sound of his own choked breathing. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, when the world outside was utterly still, a shift occurred. The frantic, desperate energy that had been driving him began to subside. He was exhausted on a cellular level. His body was a husk, his mind a hollowed-out cavern. There were no more tears to cry. The great crashing waves of memory and emotion had passed, and what was left was a slower, deeper current. His handwriting began to change. The jagged, angry characters softened. The frantic scrawl became more measured. He was no longer writing from inside the storm, but as a witness to it. He began to describe his own pain, not as a raw, open wound, but as a phenomenon he was observing. He wrote, "There is a great sadness in my chest. It feels like a stone." He was no longer the stone, he was the one feeling it. The small distinction he had felt before he began was now a vast, clear space. He wrote about the journey up the mountain, the fear during the thunderstorm, the simple gratitude for being dry. He wrote about Soko's quiet kindness, about the taste of the master's tea, about the profound peace of the empty room. He was no longer just emptying the bitter tea. He was beginning to describe the cup itself. As the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, turning the mist outside his window from black to a soft, luminous gray, he picked up a fresh sheet of paper. He dipped his brush, and for a long moment he held it, poised. He realized there was nothing left to say. The river had run its course. It had flowed out of him, leaving behind not a desert, but a clean, quiet riverbed. He was empty. He looked at the huge, chaotic pile of paper. It was a testament to his suffering, a physical record of his inner world. It was ugly, messy, and painful to look at, but it was also honest. It was true. And it was no longer inside him. It was there, on the desk, separate from him. With a steady hand, a hand that was no longer trembling, he wrote a single character on the final, clean sheet of paper. It was the character for mu, meaning nothingness or emptiness. It was the first character he had written that was not born of pain or memory. It was a simple observation of his present state. He placed the brush down beside the inkstone. He looked out the window at the rising sun, which was beginning to burn through the mist, and for the first time in over a year, he felt the quiet, simple possibility of a new day. The river of ink had finally reached the sea. The silence that followed the final stroke of the brush was profound. It was not the heavy, oppressive silence of his sleepless nights, nor the expectant silence he had felt before meeting the master. This was a new kind of silence. It was vast, open, and clean, like the sky after a storm has washed the air of all its dust. His ears seemed to ring with it. He sat, perfectly still, listening to this new emptiness, exploring its contours. His body, which had been a vessel of frantic energy, was now completely still. He became aware of it in a way he hadn't been for the long hours of the night. He felt the deep, rhythmic ache in his spine, the sharp protest of his cramped fingers as he slowly uncurled them from their claw-like grip on the brush. He felt the stiffness in his neck, the raw, scratchy feeling in his throat. But these sensations were just that, sensations. They were not imbued with the story of his suffering. They were simply the physical truths of a body that had worked hard. There was a strange purity to them, an honesty that he found almost comforting. He looked down at his hands,
They were caked with dried ink. The black pigment settled deep into the lines of his palms and under his fingernails. They looked like the hands of a different man, a calligrapher, a scholar, a painter. But they were his hands, the same hands that had held his father's cold one, the same hands that had trembled with rage and grief, the same hands that had failed to hold a chisel steady. Now they were still, stained with the physical evidence of his long night's work. They did not feel weak or useless anymore. They felt quiet. The sun was higher now, and its rays slanted into the room, illuminating the chaos of his desk. The piles of paper were a jumble of black and white, some pages still damp, others curled at the edges where tears had dried. It looked like the aftermath of a battle, and in a way, it had been. A battle not against an external enemy, but against the ghosts within himself. He had not vanquished them, he realized. He had simply given them a place to rest, a home outside the confines of his own heart. He felt no pride in what he had done, no sense of accomplishment. Instead, what washed over him was a feeling of profound humility. He had seen the full landscape of his own mind, its darkest valleys and its most treacherous peaks. He had seen his own pettiness, his pride, his anger, his deep well of sorrow, and he had survived it. He had not turned away. He had stayed with the pain until it had exhausted itself. Slowly, carefully, he began to gather the pages. He did not try to put them in order. There was no order to the torrent of his memory. He simply collected them into a single, thick stack. The paper was heavy, dense with the weight of the ink and the moisture of his tears. Holding the stack in his hands was a strange sensation. This was his burden, his collection of unseen stones, now made visible, tangible. It was a heavy, unwieldy thing. He could feel the sharp edges of the paper, the rough texture of the ink-soaked sheets. He had carried this inside him. The thought was staggering. No wonder he could not breathe. No wonder he could not work. No wonder he could not sleep. He stood up, his legs stiff and unsteady. He walked to the window and looked out. The mist was almost gone, burned away by the morning sun. The world below was revealed in breathtaking detail. He could see the dark green tapestry of the forest, the silver thread of a river winding through a distant valley, the patchwork of fields, and the tiny cluster of roofs that was his own village. It all looked so small from up here, so peaceful. The world had continued on in all its intricate, indifferent beauty, while he had been lost in his own private storm. The sight did not make him feel insignificant. It made him feel connected. His own small story of suffering was just one thread in that vast tapestry, a single drop in that silver river. He remained at the window for a long time, just breathing. He followed the air as it entered his body, cool and clean, and as it left, warm and used. It was the simplest form of meditation, the one his father had tried to teach him. If your mind is here with the breath, it cannot be lost somewhere else. For the first time, the teaching was not a memory tinged with pain, but a living reality. His mind was with his breath. It was not in the past. It was not in the future. It was here, now, in this quiet room, in this tired body, looking out at the morning sun. A soft sound from the corridor broke his reverie. The paper screen slid open, and Soko stood there, holding another tray. He looked at Kaito, at the stack of papers in his hands, at the ink-stained chaos of the desk, and at the quiet emptiness in Kaito's eyes. Soko's own expression remained serene, but there was a flicker of something in his gaze, a deep, compassionate understanding. He did not need to ask if the task was complete. He could see it. "The master is in the garden," Soko said simply. He placed the tray on the floor. It held a basin of warm water, a clean cloth, and a fresh pot of tea. The unspoken message was clear. Clean yourself. Prepare yourself. The next step is waiting. Kaito bowed his head in gratitude. He carried the heavy stack of papers and placed it carefully on the tatami mat, well away from the water basin. Then he knelt and began to wash. He dipped the cloth into the warm water and slowly, methodically, began to clean the ink from his hands and face. The black pigment dissolved into the water, turning it a murky gray. As he washed, it felt like a ritual of purification. He was not just washing away the ink, he was washing away the residue of the long night, the physical traces of his confession. He watched the dark swirls in the water, a miniature river of ink, and felt a sense of finality. That part was over. When he was finished, he drank the tea Soko had left. It was a different kind of tea from the master's, a simple, roasted twig tea. It had an earthy, robust flavor that felt deeply nourishing to his empty stomach. It was the taste of the earth, of the mountain, of simple, solid reality. It was the perfect antidote to the ghostly world of memory he had inhabited all night. With the stack of papers held carefully in both hands, he followed Soko out of the temple and into the morning light. The air was bright and cool. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The sounds of the temple were gentle and rhythmic, the distant, steady thump of an axe splitting wood, the soft whisk of a broom on gravel, the drone of a bee investigating a flowering bush near the veranda. These were the sounds of a world engaged in simple, present action. Soko led him around the main building to the small, enclosed garden he had seen from the master's tea room. Ryokan was there. He was not meditating or performing a ceremony. He was on his hands and knees, his dark blue robes tucked around him, carefully pulling tiny weeds from between the moss-covered stones. He was completely absorbed in his task, his wrinkled fingers moving with gentle precision. He looked like any old village gardener, tending his small patch of earth. He did not look up as they approached. Soko stopped at the edge of the garden and gave Kaito a small bow before retreating silently, leaving him alone with the master once more. Kaito stood there, holding his heavy stack of written sorrows, feeling awkward and uncertain again. He had poured out his entire soul onto these pages. He had exposed every weakness, every shame, every secret pain. And now he was to present this raw, chaotic testament to this calm old man, who was currently more interested in a tiny sprout of clover. He waited. He did not speak. He had learned from his first encounter that the master operated on his own time, a deep, slow rhythm that could not be hurried. So Kaito stood and watched and breathed. He watched the master's patient work, the care he took with each tiny weed, pulling it up by the roots without disturbing the delicate moss around it. It was the same quality of attention he brought to making tea, the same complete absorption in the present moment. Kaito realized he was receiving a teaching right now, without a single word being spoken. This is how you live, the master's actions seemed to say. You give your whole self to whatever is before you, whether it is preparing tea for a guest or pulling a weed from the ground. Finally, Ryokan placed a last, tiny weed on a small pile beside him, brushed the dirt from his hands, and looked up at Kaito. His eyes, in the bright morning sun, were as clear and calm as they had been in the dim light of the tea room. His gaze fell on the thick stack of papers in Kaito's arms. He did not ask what was in them. He did not need to. He simply nodded, a look of quiet acknowledgement on his face. Part 5. The silence between the characters. Kaito stood in the bright morning of the garden, his arms laden with the physical weight of his sorrow. He held the stack of papers out, a silent offering, the culmination of his journey and his long, dark night of the soul. He expected the master to take them, perhaps to weigh them in his hands, to acknowledge
the sheer volume of the pain contained within. It was, he felt, the most honest and complete thing he had ever created. Ryokan looked from the papers to Kaito's face, his gaze lingering for a moment. Then he turned his attention back to the small patch of earth he had been tending. He pointed with a wrinkled finger to a spot near Kaito's feet. "The sun is warm on this stone," he said, his voice a quiet murmur. "The moss likes the morning sun, but not the afternoon heat. It is a very particular thing, moss." Kaito was bewildered. He was offering up the raw, bleeding contents of his heart, and the master was discussing moss. He stood there, his arms beginning to ache, the stack of papers feeling heavier by the second. A flicker of his old frustration, his old feeling of being unseen, sparked within him. Ryokan seemed to sense it without looking up. "The story is important," he said, his voice gentle as he coaxed another tiny weed from the soil. "It is good to know your story, but a man who does nothing but read his own story over and over becomes a prisoner of the book. The world is full of other things, like this moss, and the warmth of the sun, and the feeling of the earth beneath your knees." He patted the ground beside him. "Your arms must be tired. Put your story down. It is not going anywhere." Slowly, feeling foolish, Kaito knelt and placed the thick stack of papers on the ground. The immediate relief in his arms was immense. He had not realized how much strain he had been under, holding it up, presenting it. "Good," Ryokan said with a small, approving nod. He did not look at the papers again. Instead, he handed Kaito a small, pointed stick. "The roots of this one are deep," he said, pointing to a stubborn-looking weed. "You must be patient with it. If you pull too hard, the root breaks and the weed returns. You must loosen the earth all around it, gently, until it is ready to let go." And so, Kaito spent the next hour on his hands and knees in the garden beside the Zen master, not discussing philosophy or the nature of suffering, but pulling weeds. He learned to feel the difference between the shallow roots of grass and the tenacious taproot of a dandelion. He learned to work with the soil, not against it. His mind, which had been braced for a profound spiritual discussion, was left with nothing to do but focus on the small, green things in front of him. He felt the sun on his back, the damp earth under his fingernails, the satisfying release as the stubborn root finally let go. When they were finished, the small patch of garden was immaculate. Ryokan stood, brushing the dirt from his knees. He looked at Kaito, then at the stack of papers sitting on the ground. "Leave it there for now," he said. "Soko will show you your work." And with that, he turned and shuffled slowly back into the temple, leaving Kaito alone in the garden with his story lying on the ground beside a pile of weeds. Soko appeared as he always seemed to do, at the exact right moment. He carried a bamboo broom, which he offered to Kaito. "The courtyard needs sweeping," he said. "The pine trees are generous with their needles." For the next several days, this became Kaito's life. He was given no more grand soul-searching tasks. He was not asked to meditate for hours or to study ancient texts. His work was simple, physical, and repetitive. He woke before dawn, his body now accustomed to the rhythm of the temple. He would join the handful of other monks for a silent meal of rice porridge. Then his work would begin. He swept the vast courtyard. At first, he approached it as a chore to be finished. His mind was restless. As his hands moved the broom, his thoughts would drift back to the stack of papers, which Soko had quietly moved to a corner of his sleeping room. He would wonder when the master would read them. He would try to imagine Ryokan's reaction to his words of pain and anger. He would compose speeches in his head, further explanations of his sorrow that he might offer when the master finally called for him. His body was sweeping leaves, but his mind was still telling its story. As a result, his sweeping was clumsy. He would leave patches of needles behind, or his rhythm would be so uneven that he would grow tired quickly. One afternoon, Soko came to sweep beside him. Kaito watched him. Soko's movements were a perfect dance of efficiency and grace. His mind, his body, and the broom were one single entity. There was no wasted motion, no sign of struggle. He was not a man forcing the leaves into a pile. He was a force of nature, like the wind, gently persuading the leaves to gather. "You are fighting the broom," Soko said, his voice quiet, not a criticism, but a simple observation. "The leaves, they are everywhere," Kaito replied, frustrated. "As soon as I sweep one spot, the wind brings more." Soko stopped and leaned on his broom. He looked up at the ancient, towering pine trees. "The trees do what they do," he said. "The wind does what it does. The leaves fall where they fall. We are not here to command the leaves. We are just here to sweep." He smiled a little. "And then tomorrow we will sweep again. The sweeping is the practice, not the clean courtyard." The words were simple, but they landed in Kaito's mind with the force of a temple bell. He had been so focused on the result, a clean courtyard, an acknowledged story, a healed heart, that he had paid no attention to the process. He had been trying to conquer his work, just as he had been trying to conquer his grief. The next morning, he picked up the broom with a new intention. He did not think about finishing. He thought only about the single sweep he was making in that moment. He felt the smooth, worn bamboo in his hands. He listened to the soft shh of the bristles on the gravel. He watched the small cascade of pine needles that moved before him. He synchronized his breath with the motion, an exhale for the push, an inhale for the pull. His mind, which had been so loud, began to quiet. When a thought arose about his past, about the master, he would simply acknowledge it, like a single stray leaf, and then gently sweep it away, returning his focus to the rhythm of the work. He began to discover a profound peace in the repetition. His other chores were the same. He was tasked with chopping wood for the kitchen and the bath. At first, he was clumsy, his mind elsewhere, and the axe would bite into the wood at a bad angle. But then he applied the lesson of the broom. He focused only on the task at hand, the weight of the axe in his hands, the rough bark of the log, the clean, sharp scent of the pine resin, the single point where he aimed to strike. He would raise the axe on an inhale and bring it down with a sharp exhale. The clean crack
of the splitting wood became a punctuation mark in the deep silence of the forest. His mind and body were united in a single powerful act. There was no room for sorrow or regret in the moment a blade meets wood. He washed the simple wooden bowls after each meal. He felt the warmth of the water, the roughness of the cleaning cloth, the smooth curved surface of the lacquered wood. He was not just washing bowls. He was practicing gratitude for the food that had been in them. He was practicing care for the simple objects that sustained their lives. He was practicing the act of clearing away the old to make way for the new. Days turned into a week, then two. He spoke very little. The life of the temple was one of quiet, purposeful action, not of discussion. He saw Master Ryokan occasionally, sometimes in the garden, sometimes walking slowly along the veranda, sometimes just sitting, looking out at the mountains. The master never spoke to him about the papers. He never asked Kaito how he was feeling. He would simply nod, his eyes holding that same calm, gentle amusement, a silent acknowledgement that Kaito was still there, still engaged in the practice. The stack of papers sat in the corner of his room. At first, its presence was a constant pull on his attention. It was his story, his identity, his pain, sitting there in a neat pile. He was tempted to read it, to immerse himself once more in the familiar currents of his grief. But the simple, grounding work of the day left him too tired, too present, to indulge in it. The papers began to lose their power. They were no longer a living, breathing monster in the corner. They were becoming just what they were: a stack of paper with ink on it, an object, a record of a storm that had passed. His senses, for so long dulled by the internal noise of his mind, began to awaken. He started to notice things with the sharp, clear eye of a carver. He saw the intricate, fractal patterns of lichen on a stone wall. He watched a spider weave its web in the corner of the woodshed, a miracle of engineering and instinct. He heard the different voices of the wind, the way it whispered through the pines versus how it hummed around the eaves of the temple roof. He could distinguish the calls of different birds. The world, which had been a gray backdrop to his inner drama, was now vibrant, alive, and speaking a language of profound, silent beauty. One evening he was sitting on the veranda watching the moon rise over the dark silhouette of the mountains. The air was cold and still. He was not thinking about anything in particular. He was just sitting, feeling the cool wood beneath him, watching the sky. And in that quiet moment, the full meaning of the master's teaching bloomed in his mind. He thought of the pages he had written, filled with the black characters of his story. He had been so obsessed with the characters themselves, the events, the emotions, the painful details. He had believed that the meaning was in the words, but he now understood that the real healing, the real peace, was not in the characters, but in the silence between them. It was in the white space on the page. His life was not the story of his father's death, his argument, his grief. Those were just the black characters, the dramatic moments. His life was the vast, unspoken white space that held those characters. It was the taste of tea on a cold morning. It was the rhythm of sweeping. It was the feeling of the sun on his back. It was the sound of the temple bell echoing through the valley. He had been so focused on the ink that he had failed to see the page itself. He understood now that the master had not been ignoring his pain by sending him to pull weeds. He had been showing him the page. He had been teaching him to inhabit the quiet, simple, present moments that make up the vast majority of a life. The pain was real. The story was real. The black characters were there, but they were not the whole thing. They were just marks on a much larger, quieter, and ultimately
more peaceful background. He looked over at his room where the stack of papers sat in the darkness. He felt no attachment to them, no fear of them. They were part of the page, but they were not the whole page. He was not the story he had written. He was the silence that held the story. A deep sense of peace settled over him, a peace that was not about forgetting the past or solving his problems, but about seeing them in their proper perspective, as small, dark marks on the vast, luminous canvas of the present moment. This understanding did not arrive like a flash of lightning, a dramatic moment of satori. It seeped into him, slowly, gently, like the morning mist rising from the valley floor. It was a quiet unfolding, a gradual realignment of his entire being. He began to see this principle of the white space everywhere. In the garden, the carefully raked sand was not just a background for the stones. The emptiness was an essential element, giving the stones their meaning and presence. In the flower, arrangements Soko sometimes made for the small altar, the space between the branches was as important as the branches themselves, defining the shape and flow of the composition. Even in sound, he discovered this truth. The temple bell would ring in the early morning, its deep, resonant tone rolling across the mountainside. Kaito had always focused on the sound itself, the initial strike. But now he began to listen to the silence that followed. He listened as the sound faded, its vibrations dissolving into the vast stillness. And he realized that the bell's true power was not in its clang, but in the way it made the silence audible. The sound was the character, the ensuing quiet was the page. His work in the woodshop, which had been a source of such torment, now appeared to him in a new light. He remembered his father's words, which had once sparked their argument. Listen to the wood, Kaito. It will tell you what it wants to be. He had thought his father was talking about the grain, the physical properties of the material. But now he understood it was something deeper. Carving was not about imposing his will upon the wood, forcing a dragon out of a block of cherry. It was a process of listening, of seeing the form that was already there, sleeping in the material. The art was not in the adding, but in the taking away. The sculptor's job was to remove everything that was not the crane, or the bodhisattva, or the sleeping fox. He was not creating the form. He was revealing it by carving away the emptiness around it. The form and the emptiness were partners in the creation. He began to feel a deep, quiet longing to hold a piece of wood again, to feel the familiar weight of a chisel in his hand. But it was a different kind of longing from before. It was not the desperate need to prove his skill or reclaim his lost identity. It was a simple, humble desire to engage in that silent conversation again, to listen to the wood and help it speak. His relationship with his own body changed as well. Before, it had been an enemy, a traitor that trembled and ached, a container for his heavy heart. Now, through the simple, repetitive labor of the temple, he began to inhabit it differently. He felt the honest fatigue in his muscles at the end of the day, not as a weakness, but as a sign of a day well lived. He felt the hunger in his stomach not as a lack, but as a readiness to receive nourishment. His body was not a prison for his mind. It was his anchor in the present moment. The feeling of the rough straw of his sandals on the soles of his feet, the coolness of the morning air on his face, the warmth of the tea bowl in his hands. These were the simple, undeniable truths of his existence. The stories in his head could lie. They could twist and turn and create endless suffering. But the body, in its simple sensations, always told the truth of the now. He even began to see the other monks differently. In his first days, he had seen them as serene, almost inhuman figures, floating through their days in a state of perfect peace he could never attain. Now, he saw them as men. He saw the sweat on Soko's brow as he carried heavy buckets of water from the well. He saw the deep lines of concentration on the face of the old cook as he sliced vegetables with a worn, razor-sharp knife. He saw the way they would sometimes smile at each other, a small, shared moment of understanding without words. Their peace was not a magical state of being. It was a practice. It was the result of countless hours of chopping wood, sweeping leaves, and sitting in silence. They were not peaceful because they had no problems. They were peaceful because they had learned to inhabit the white space between their problems. One afternoon, Soko found him sitting on the veranda, staring into the woodshed. Kaito had just finished stacking the day's split logs, and the shed was filled with the clean, sharp scent of pine. The logs were arranged in a neat, interlocking pattern, a simple sculpture of order and purpose. "Your stacking has improved," Soko said, his voice holding its usual calm neutrality. "The first week, your piles looked like they were ready to argue with each other. Now, they look like they are meditating." Kaito smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. "I am learning to listen to the wood," he said. Soko nodded. He sat down beside Kaito, his own gaze following Kaito's into the shadows of the woodshed. For a long time, they sat in a comfortable silence, two figures watching a pile of wood as the afternoon light slanted through the trees. "The master asked me a question once," Soko said, his voice soft, as if he were speaking to himself. He asked, "What is the sound of one hand clapping?" I spent a month thinking about it. I tried to find a clever answer. I thought about the wind, about a hand slapping a table. Nothing seemed right. I was getting very frustrated. Kaito listened, his attention complete. "Then one day," Soko continued, "I was in the kitchen, washing rice. I was swirling my hand in the bucket of cold water, feeling the grains of rice slip through my fingers. My mind was completely empty. I was not thinking about the master's question. I was just washing the rice. And suddenly, I knew the answer." "What was it?" Kaito asked, his curiosity piqued. Soko turned to him, and for the first time, Kaito saw a bright, almost mischievous twinkle in the monk's calm eyes. "The sound of one hand clapping," Soko said, "is the sound of washing rice." He stood up, brushed off his robes, and walked away, leaving Kaito to ponder his words. Kaito thought about it for the rest of the day. It was not a logical answer. It was a koan, a riddle designed to break the chains of rational thought. And as he sat there, the scent of the pine logs filling his senses, he understood. The answer was not an idea. The answer was the experience itself. The sound of one hand was the feeling of the water, the texture of the rice, the complete absorption in the present moment. It was the white space. It was the silence between the characters. That night, as he lay on his futon, he did not look at the stack of papers in the corner. He did not need to. He knew the story that was in them, but it no longer defined him. He was the quiet room that held the papers. He was the silence that held the sound of the temple bell. He was the stillness that held the memory of his father. He closed his eyes, and for the first time since that terrible morning a year ago, he felt not the weight of his father's absence,
but the gentle, quiet presence of his father's love, a silent, supportive page on which his own life was written. And in that deep, quiet peace, he drifted easily into a dreamless sleep. The last of Part 6. The season began to turn. The crispness of late autumn gave way to the sharp, clean bite of early winter. A fine, dry snow dusted the high peaks, and the mountain air grew thin and crystalline. Kaito's time at the temple had stretched from days into weeks, and the weeks had blurred into a rhythm so natural it felt as if he had lived this way his entire life. The urgency he had arrived with, the desperate need for a cure, had dissolved into the slow, patient current of the temple's daily life. He had stopped waiting for something to happen, for a grand moment of healing. He had learned that the healing was not an event, but a process, and the process was happening in every swing of the axe, every sweep of the broom, every silent, shared meal. His hands, once the source of his shame, had become his teachers. The tremor was gone, replaced by a deep, steady strength. The calluses on his palms, once a reminder of a skill he had lost, were now a testament to the honest work he was doing. He had learned a new language with them, not the delicate language of the chisel, but the earthy, solid grammar of chopping wood and washing bowls. He felt a quiet pride in their competence and their ability to serve the simple, essential needs of the community. One morning after the morning meal, Soko approached him. "The master wishes to see you," he said. There was no special emphasis in his voice, but Kaito felt a shift in the air, a sense that a chapter was coming to a close. He had not had a formal meeting with Ryokan since that first day. He followed Soko not to the tea room, but to a small, seldom-used hall at the back of the temple. The room was bare except for a small charcoal brazier, its embers glowing a soft, warm red. Ryokan was there, seated on a cushion, his back straight, his hands resting in his lap. He was simply sitting, gazing at the glowing coals, as if they held all the secrets of the universe. He did not look up as Kaito entered and knelt before him. Kaito waited in silence. He was no longer the anxious, desperate man who had first entered the master's presence. He was able to sit in the silence without needing to fill it. He simply knelt, his posture relaxed but upright, and joined the master in watching the coals breathe, glowing brighter with an invisible inhalation, then softening with an exhale. After a long time, Ryokan spoke, his voice a low rumble. "The ink is dry," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, master," Kaito replied. "The pages have been sitting in your room," Ryokan continued. "They have been quiet guests. Have you spoken with them?" "No, master," Kaito said. "I have had nothing to say to them, and they have had nothing to say to me." Ryokan finally turned his head and looked at Kaito. His gaze was searching, but not judging. It was the gaze of a master craftsman examining a piece of wood, feeling its weight, sensing its inner nature. "You have been chopping wood," he said. "Soko tells me your wood piles are very beautiful." "I have been practicing," Kaito said. "I have been listening to the wood." "And what does the wood say?" the master asked. Kaito thought for a moment, not trying to find a clever answer, but searching for the truth of his own experience. "It says that it is what it is. It says that it can be a pillar for a temple, or it can be ash in a fire. But its nature is to be wood. It does not worry about what it will become." A slow smile spread across Ryokan's wrinkled face. It was a smile of genuine warmth and approval. "Good," he said. "You have learned the language of the mountain. Now, go and fetch your story. It is time for it to finish its journey."
Kaito bowed and left the room. He walked back to his own small cell, his heart calm and steady. He looked at the stack of papers in the corner. It looked smaller than he remembered, less menacing. It was just an object. He picked it up. The weight was familiar, but it no longer felt like his own burden. It felt like something he had been carrying for a friend, a task he was about to complete. He returned to the hall and knelt before the master once more. He held the stack of papers out with both hands. This time, his arms did not tremble. He was not offering up his pain for inspection. He was simply presenting the finished product of a long and difficult labor. It was a confession, a history, a testament. It was the last drop of ink from a well that was now empty. He expected Ryokan to take the stack, to at least glance at the top page, at the chaotic scrawl of his first outpouring of grief. He was prepared for the master's eyes to scan his words, to judge his penmanship, his grammar, his soul. He had poured everything of himself onto those pages, and he felt a strange mix of detachment and a final, lingering vulnerability. This was the moment of truth, the final assessment. Ryokan looked at the stack of papers. Then he looked at Kaito's face. He looked at his clear eyes, his calm posture, the steady way he held the heavy pile. He saw the ink stains that were still faintly visible under his fingernails. He saw the new strength in his shoulders. He saw the quiet peace that had settled deep within him. And then Ryokan did something that Kaito could never have anticipated. He smiled, a gentle, almost playful smile, and he shook his head. He did not reach for the papers. "No," the master said, his voice soft but firm. "That is your story. It is not for me to read." Kaito was stunned. All this time he had believed that the purpose of the writing was to communicate his suffering to the master, to have his pain witnessed and validated by a wise man. He had thought the writing was a letter, and now the intended recipient was refusing to open it. A wave of confusion washed over him. If it was not for the master, then who was it for? What was the point of it all? Ryokan watched the confusion play across Kaito's face. He let him sit with it for a moment, letting the question deepen. "The point of writing a letter," Ryokan said, as if reading his mind, "is not always in the reading. Sometimes the point is in the writing. The purpose of pouring out the bitter tea is not so the tea master can taste it and tell you how bitter it is. The purpose is to empty the cup, so that there is room for something new." He gestured with his chin toward the stack of papers. "You did not write that for me, Kaito. You wrote it for you. You did the work. You faced the ghosts. You walked through the storm. The journey was the destination. The writing was the healing. The story has already done its work. Its purpose is complete." The master's words settled into Kaito's mind, and a profound understanding bloomed. He had been so focused on the final step, the judgment, the analysis, that he had missed the entire point. The process was the purpose. The master had not given him a task to be graded. He had given him a tool to save himself. Ryokan's role was not to read the story, but to provide the empty room, the blank paper, and the silent, unwavering faith that Kaito could do the work himself. The master's wisdom was not in his analysis, but in his refusal to analyze. He was not a doctor who would diagnose the wound. He was a guide who had shown Kaito how to let the wound heal itself. Kaito looked down at the pages in his hands. He saw them now in a completely new light. They were not a plea for help. They were a declaration of strength. They were the shed skin of a snake, the empty chrysalis of a butterfly.
They were the evidence of a transformation that had already occurred. They were the past, and he was the present. He slowly lowered the stack and placed it on the mat before him. He looked at the master, and his eyes filled with a gratitude so immense it left him speechless. It was a gratitude not for being saved, but for being shown that he had the power to save himself. "I understand," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Ryokan nodded, his eyes kind. "Good," he said. "Then you know what must be done next." He reached over to the glowing brazier with a pair of small iron tongs. He carefully picked out a single, bright red coal, a perfect jewel of heat and light. He placed the coal on a small ceramic tile he had set beside him. "The story has served its purpose," Ryokan said, his gaze steady on Kaito's face. "It has been heard. It has been honored. Now it must be released. A boat is essential for crossing a river, but a wise man does not carry the boat on his back once he has reached the other shore. This," he said, gesturing to the stack of papers, "is your boat. You have reached the other shore. It is time to let it go." He pushed the tile with the glowing coal gently across the mat toward Kaito. "The final drop of ink has been written. Now comes the final act of release, the gift of fire." Kaito looked from the master's calm face to the pulsing red coal, then to the heavy stack of his own history. He was being asked to destroy the most honest thing he had ever made, to turn the record of his entire inner world to ash. A month ago, the thought would have been terrifying, an act of erasure, of denial. But now, it felt right. It felt like the only possible conclusion. It was not an act of destruction. It was an act of liberation. It was the final, definitive step of leaving the past in the past, of truly, completely letting go. He reached out his hand, his fingers steady, and took the top sheet from the pile. It was the first page he had written, the chaotic, tear-stained account of his father's death. He held it for a moment, not reading the words, but feeling the memory of the man who had written them. He was not that man anymore. With a deep, cleansing breath, he touched the corner of the page to the glowing coal. The paper, dry and fragile from its time in his room, hesitated for only a heartbeat. Then, a tiny orange line appeared where it touched the coal, a silent, hungry mouth. It began to eat the page. There was no sudden burst of flame, but a slow, inexorable consumption. A thread of pale grey smoke, thin as a spider's silk, rose from the glowing edge and spiraled upward into the still air of the room. It carried with it the faint, dry scent of burning paper and ink. Kaito watched, his entire being focused on this small, quiet act of transformation. The orange line crept across the page, tracing the edges of his frantic, tear-blurred characters. It consumed his father's name. It devoured the words of shock and disbelief. The black ink, the residue of his deepest pain, flared for a moment, turning a brighter orange before vanishing into the creeping line of fire. He was not just watching paper burn. He was watching his own sorrow being unwritten.
its form dissolving, its substance changing into heat and light and smoke. He held the page until the heat began to lick at his fingertips. Then, he gently dropped the last curling black remnant into a heavy ceramic bowl that Ryokan had placed nearby. The small piece of ash, so light that it seemed to hover for a moment, settled at the bottom, a dark, fragile ghost of the heavy words it had once carried. He reached for the next page without hesitation. This was the one about the argument, the bitter words, the deep, corrosive regret. He touched it to the coal, again the slow, silent fire. He watched the characters for "I am sorry" and "forgive me" turn to smoke. He had poured all his desperate yearning for a second chance onto this page, and now the fire was taking it, offering no second chance but something far more profound, a complete release. He was not being forgiven by his father's ghost. He was releasing himself from the need to be forgiven. The act was complete in itself. The apology had been made to the universe, and now the universe was accepting it, turning it into elemental components and scattering them on the air. He continued, page by page. It became a slow, meditative rhythm. Reach for a page, touch it to the coal, watch the fire consume the words, release the ash into the bowl. Each page was a stone, and with each burning he felt the pile on his heart grow lighter. He burned the memories of his childhood. The description of his father's hands guiding his own was consumed by the flame. But the memory itself did not vanish from his mind. Instead, it was cleansed of its painful associations. The fire was not burning the memory, it was burning the grief that clung to it. What remained was the pure, simple warmth of the memory itself, a clean, bright image no longer coated in the soot of sorrow. He burned the pages of his anger, the jagged, fierce characters that had cursed the universe for its cruelty flared and vanished. And as they did, he felt the tight, hard knot of anger in his own chest loosen its grip. The fire was taking his rage, accepting its heat, and transforming it into its own. He was not suppressing his anger, he was offering it up, and in the offering it was purified. He burned the pages about his lost craft, his fear that his skill had died with his father. He watched the words describing the tremor in his hands, the lifelessness of the wood, the scarred carving of the fox, all turned to ash. These were the stories he had told himself about his own failure, the identity he had constructed as a broken artist. As the fire took them, he felt the weight of that false identity lift. He was not a broken artist. He was a man who had been through a great sorrow. He was a carver who had put down his tools for a time. That was all. The story was not the man. The room grew warmer, filled with a haze of smoke that caught the light from the window in a diffuse golden glow. The air was thick with the scent of burning, but it was not an acrid or unpleasant smell. It was the clean, elemental smell of change. Ryokan sat opposite him, perfectly still, his eyes half closed. He was not watching Kaito, but he was completely present with him. His silence was a powerful, supportive vessel, creating a safe space for this profound ritual to unfold. He was a silent witness, a human brazier holding the space for this inner alchemy. Kaito came to the pages he had written in the deepest part of the night, the ones where he had begun to observe his own pain rather than just express it. He burned the page where he had written, "There is a great sadness in my chest. It feels like a stone." As the words disappeared, he felt the last faint echo of that weight in his chest dissolve.
It was gone. Not just lessened, not just manageable, but gone. In its place was not a void, but a sense of lightness, of open space. He burned the pages describing his journey, the storm, the simple taste of the rice ball by the stream. These were not painful memories, but they were part of the same story, the same boat that had carried him across the river. They, too, had to be released. He was no longer the man who had struggled up the mountain. He was the man who had arrived. The pile of paper beside him dwindled. The bowl of ash grew. It was a strange and beautiful transformation. What had been a heavy, dense stack of sorrow was becoming a light, almost weightless pile of soft gray ash. It was a physical demonstration of impermanence. The most solid-seeming things, grief, regret, anger, identity, were, in the end, as transient as a wisp of smoke, as fragile as a flake of ash. Finally, he came to the very last page. It was the single sheet on which he had written only one character, Mu, the symbol for emptiness, for nothingness. It was the page he had written not with a full heart, but with an empty one. It represented the quiet stillness he had found at the end of his long river of ink. He paused, holding this last sheet. To burn this one felt different. It felt like burning the destination itself. He looked at the master. Ryokan's eyes opened, as if he sensed the question. He gave the slightest of nods. Yes, this too. Kaito understood. The emptiness he had found was not a destination to be clung to, not a prize to be held. It was just another state, another moment on the path. To hold on to the idea of emptiness was to fill it up again. True emptiness had to be empty even of itself. He touched the final page to the coal. The single, elegant character for Mu held its form for a moment in the orange line of fire, a beautiful, stark image against the flame. Then it too dissolved, flared, and vanished. It was the final, perfect paradox, the symbol for nothingness turning into nothing. The last drop of ink had been consumed. The story was over. He placed his hands on his knees and looked at the bowl. It was full of a soft, uniform gray ash, with a few darker flakes of black from the densest ink. A slight breeze from the window stirred the very top layer, and a few motes of ash lifted, dancing in the shaft of sunlight like the dust. Motes he had seen in his father's room on that terrible morning. But now they did not seem sad or indifferent. They seemed alive, free, particles of his released past rejoining the endless, moving present. He had expected to feel a great, dramatic catharsis, a surge of joy or a flood of relief. But what he felt was much quieter and much deeper. It was a profound and unshakable stillness. It was the silence not between the characters, but after the last character has been written and the book has been closed. It was the peace of a story that has been told, honored, and finally laid to rest. He was no longer Kaido the grieving son, or Kaido the failed artist. He was just Kaido, a man, sitting in a quiet room, breathing. It was enough. The gift of fire. The last wisp of smoke from the final page ascended, thinned, and vanished into the hazy, sunlit air of the hall. The room was quiet again, save for the soft, rhythmic breathing of the two men and the gentle whisper of the embers in the brazier. Kaido's hands rested on his knees, no longer clenched, no longer trembling, but open and relaxed. He looked at the bowl of ash, the final physical remnant of his great burden. It was so light, so fragile. It was hard to believe that it had once been a weight capable of crushing his spirit.
Ryokan stirred, his movements slow and deliberate. He took the iron tongs and carefully arranged the coals in the brazier, his attention as focused and complete as if he were arranging flowers. The small mundane actions served as a gentle anchor, pulling the moment back from the realm of the sacred and mystical into the simple, solid present. "Ash is a good teacher," the master said, his voice soft, not breaking the stillness but becoming a part of it. "It teaches us where all things are headed. The strongest tree, the most beautiful temple, our own bodies, all eventually become ash. It is not a sad thing. It is the nature of things. To understand this is to find peace." He looked at Kaito, his eyes clear and direct. "You brought a great, heavy stone up the mountain, Kaito, but you did not bring it to me. You brought it to the fire. Fire does not judge. It does not offer opinions. It does not give advice. It only does one thing. It transforms. It takes what is heavy and dense, and it makes it light. It turns it into heat and smoke and ash, and gives it back to the sky. This is the gift of fire. It is the great purifier." Kaito bowed his head, absorbing the words. He had thought he needed a wise man's absolution, but what he had truly needed was this elemental process. He had needed a ritual, a tangible act to signify the inner shift that had taken place. The writing had been the excavation, the digging out of the poison. The fire was the antidote, the alchemical process that rendered the poison harmless. "When a log is burned," Ryokan continued, his gaze drifting back to the glowing coals, "it does not resist, it does not cling to its form as a log. It gives itself over to the process completely. In its surrender, it creates warmth and light. You have done the same. You have surrendered your story to the fire. In doing so, you have created a space inside yourself for warmth and light to grow again." The master stood up, his old bones creaking softly. "Come," he said. "The ash has one more journey to make." Kaito rose and carefully picked up the ceramic bowl. It was still warm to the touch. He followed Ryokan out of the hall, back into the brilliant, cold air of the winter morning. The sky was a deep, piercing blue, and the snow on the distant peaks glittered in the sun. The world felt freshly made, washed clean. Ryokan led him not toward the front courtyard or the garden, but along a narrow, winding path that led away from the temple buildings, deeper into the mountain's embrace. The path was slick, with patches of ice, and they had to walk carefully. It wound through a grove of ancient cedars, their massive trunks like the pillars of a great outdoor cathedral. The air here was intensely still, and smelled of cold stone and the sharp, clean scent of the cedar trees. The path ended at a small clearing on the edge of a cliff. A few weathered stone statues of Jizo, the protector of travelers, stood silently, their faces softened by centuries of wind and rain, small piles of snow resting on their heads like white caps. From this vantage point, the view was immense. The world fell away beneath them, a vast panorama of mountains and valleys stretching to the horizon. A hawk circled on the updrafts far below, a silent, effortless master of the great emptiness. Ryokan walked to the very edge of the cliff. He turned and looked at Kaito, then at the bowl of ash in his hands. "The words came from your heart," he said. "They were given form on the paper. The fire has released their form. Now the wind will release their substance. Give them to the mountain. Give them to the sky." Kaito stepped forward, his straw sandals crunching on the thin layer of snow. He stood beside the master at the edge of the world. He felt the wind, a steady, cold current rising up from the valley. It tugged at the sleeves of his robe and whispered in his ears. He looked down into the bowl. The ash was a soft, uniform gray, a substance of pure memory, of pure release. It held the ghost of his father, the echo of his anger, the shadow of his fear. It was everything he had been. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the clean, thin mountain air. He thought of his father, not with the sharp pain of grief, but with a quiet, profound love. He thought of his craft, not with the shame of failure, but with a gentle, reawakening curiosity. He thought of himself, not as a broken man, but as an empty cup, ready to be filled. Then, with a simple, fluid motion, he tilted the bowl and offered its contents to the wind. The ash did not fall. It rose. Caught by the updraft, the gray cloud lifted from the bowl and swirled into the vast blue emptiness. For a moment it held its shape, a ghostly plume of smoke against the sky. Then the wind took it, scattering it, thinning it, until it was no longer a cloud, but a million individual motes, sparkling in the sunlight as they were carried out over the valley. He watched until the very last visible particle had disappeared, dissolved into the immense, indifferent beauty of the world. He stood there, holding the empty bowl. It felt light in his hands, a simple, hollowed-out piece of fired earth. And he felt a lightness in his own being that mirrored it. The last of the weight was gone. The story was not just finished. It was scattered, returned to the elements, its energy dispersed back into the great, flowing current of life. He had not destroyed his past. He had integrated it. He had allowed it to become a part of the landscape, like the rocks and the trees and the hawk circling in the sky. He and Ryokan stood in silence for a long time, side by side, two small figures on the edge of a great cliff, watching the empty sky, where the ashes of a great sorrow had just vanished. "Do you see?" Ryokan said at last, his voice barely more than a whisper on the wind. "It is gone. But it is also everywhere. It is in the air you are breathing. It is in the light that is warming your face. It has not been erased. It has been transformed. This is the nature of all things. Nothing is ever truly lost. It only changes its form." Kaito turned to the master. "Thank you," he said. The two words felt small and inadequate, but they were filled with the entire weight of his transformed heart. Ryokan placed a hand on his shoulder. The touch was light, but Kaito felt a warmth and strength in it that seemed to flow directly from the mountain itself. "I did nothing," the master said. "The mountain was here. The paper was here. The fire was here. You were the one who did the work. You were the one who was brave enough to write and brave enough to burn." They walked back to the temple in a comfortable silence. The world seemed different to Kaito now. The colors were brighter, the sounds were clearer. It was as if a layer of gray dust had been wiped from his senses. He felt a profound sense of connection to everything around him. The rough bark of the cedars, the cold stone beneath his feet, the vast sky above. He was not a visitor here. He was a part of it all. Over the next few days, a subtle shift occurred in his life at the temple. He continued with his chores, chopping wood, sweeping leaves, but there was a new quality to his work. Before, he had been practicing presence, using the work to quiet his mind. Now, the presence was simply there. The quiet was his natural state. The work flowed from that stillness, rather than being a path to it. He found himself smiling more, not a wide, boisterous grin, but a small, gentle smile that seemed to rise up from some deep, quiet well of contentment inside him. He began to speak a little more with Soko and the other monks, not engaging in idle chatter, but in simple, direct communication. He asked the old cook about the names of the mountain vegetables he was preparing. He talked to the monk who tended the garden about the best way to protect the radishes from the frost. He was no longer a patient, an outsider being healed. He was becoming a member of the community. One afternoon, he was sharpening an axe on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on stone, a meditative sound in the cold air. He was completely absorbed in the task, feeling the precise angle of the blade, watching the new sharp edge emerge from the dull metal. He was not thinking of anything, just feeling the process, his hands sure and steady. Soko came and stood nearby, watching him. Kaito finished his work, tested the blade with his thumb, and nodded, satisfied. "Your hands are steady now," Soko observed. "Yes," Kaito said. "They are quiet." "A carver's hands should not be quiet for too long," Soko said, a hint of a smile in his voice. "They grow restless. They need to speak their own language." He held out a small, gnarled piece of wood. It was a branch of cherry, seasoned and hard, with a beautiful, swirling grain. "I found this on the mountain. It looked like it had a story to tell, but I do not speak its language. Perhaps you do." Kaito took the piece of wood. It felt warm and alive in his hands. He turned it over, feeling its weight, its balance, its contours. He ran his thumb along the intricate grain. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in over a year, he listened to the wood, and it spoke. It did not speak in words, but in a language of form, of potential. He could feel the shape that was sleeping inside it. It was not a grand, dramatic dragon. It was something much quieter, much simpler. He looked at Soko, and his heart was filled with a quiet, simple joy. "I think I will need my tools," he said. Soko nodded, his expression revealing nothing but a calm understanding. He had not offered the wood as a test, but as a simple, natural continuation of Kaito's path. It was like offering water to a thirsty man. There was no need for grand pronouncements. The tools were not in the temple, of course. They were miles away, down the mountain, in the silent, dusty workshop he had abandoned. The thought of the journey, which had once been so monumental and fraught with despair, now seemed simple. It was just a walk. "The path is easier going down," Soko said, as if sensing Kaito's thoughts. "But the mountain is always here when you need it." That evening, Kaito sat with Master Ryokan for the evening meal. It was a rare honor. Usually, the master took his meals alone. They ate in silence, the only sounds the soft click of their chopsticks against the simple ceramic bowls, and the wind humming a low tune outside the paper screens. The food was plain: steamed rice, miso soup with winter greens, and a small portion of salty pickled plum. To Kaito, it tasted like the most exquisite feast he had ever eaten. Each flavor was distinct, vibrant, a gift from the mountain. He ate slowly,
with the same focused attention he had learned to bring to all his tasks. When the meal was finished and the bowls were empty, Ryokan poured them both a cup of tea. He held his cup in both hands, letting the steam warm his face, and looked at Kaito over the rim. "Soko tells me you have found a new friend," the master said, his eyes twinkling. "A piece of cherry wood." "Yes, master," Kaito replied. "It has been waiting a long time to speak." "All things find their voice in their own time," Ryokan said. He took a slow sip of tea. "A seed does not sprout the day after it is planted. It must wait for the right conditions. It needs the darkness of the earth, the cold of winter, the nourishment of the rain. It needs to be forgotten by the gardener for a while. Then, when the time is right, it pushes its way toward the sun." He looked at Kaito pointedly. "You have been a seed in the dark earth for a long time. You have had the cold and the rain. Perhaps the sun is beginning to shine." Kaito felt the truth of the master's words settle deep inside him. His time of grief and inertia had not been a waste. It had been a necessary winter, a fallow period for his soul. He had needed that darkness to gather the strength for this new beginning. "My tools are in my village," Kaito said, the words both a statement and a question. "Tools are meant to be used," Ryokan said simply. He set his cup down. "The world does not need more angry dragons, Kaito. It has enough of those. But it can always use a little more quiet beauty. It can always use another reminder of the peace that lies sleeping inside all things." The master's gaze was soft, but it held a clear, deep power. "Go. Listen to the wood. Your work here is finished. Your real work is about to begin." The next morning, Kaito prepared to leave. He had nothing to pack but the spare robe he had arrived with, his water gourd, and the small, precious piece of cherry wood, which he wrapped carefully in a cloth and tucked into his sleeve. He went to say his farewells. He found the old cook in the kitchen, who pressed a rice ball into his hand for the journey. He found the other monks in the courtyard, and they bowed to him, not as a visitor, but as a brother on the path. He found Soko by the main gate, sweeping the last of the morning's frost from the stones. Soko stopped his work and looked at Kaito. There was no sadness in his expression, only a profound, peaceful acceptance. "The mountain will miss the sound of your axe," Soko said. "And I will miss the sound of your broom," Kaito replied. They stood for a moment in a silence that was filled with unspoken gratitude. Soko had been his first guide, his quiet teacher, the one who had sustained him with tea and porridge and simple, profound observations. "Do not forget the silence between the characters," Soko said, his final piece of advice. "I will not," Kaito promised. He bowed deeply, and Soko returned the gesture. As he turned to leave, he saw Ryokan standing on the veranda, a small, still figure in the bright morning sun. The master did not speak or wave. He simply stood, a silent, unwavering presence, a human embodiment of the mountain itself. Kaito bowed to him one last time, a gesture of immense respect and love. Then he turned his back on the temple and began to walk down the path. The journey down was, as Soko had predicted, much easier than the climb. His legs were strong, his lungs were clear, and his heart was light. The world that had seemed so menacing and difficult on his ascent now revealed itself as a place of stunning beauty. He saw the way the sunlight filtered through the high canopy of the cedars, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow on the path. He heard the musical gurgle of the stream he had stopped at, and he paused to drink the cold, clear water, not out of desperate thirst, but out of simple pleasure.
He was not running from anything now. He was walking toward something. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace, his mind as calm and open as the vast blue sky above him. He felt the piece of cherry wood tucked in his sleeve, a warm, solid promise. When he reached the spot where he had sheltered from the storm, he stopped. He looked at the shallow overhang, the great boulder that had protected him. On his way up, it had been a refuge born of fear. Now he saw it as a gift. He bowed to the rock, a silent thank you for its shelter. The storm inside him had been just as fierce as the storm outside, and he had found shelter from both. He reached the edge of the village in the late afternoon. The familiar sights and sounds, the laughter of children, the smell of wood smoke from evening fires, the lowing of a cow, did not trigger his old sense of alienation. He felt a gentle, warm affection for this simple, human world. He was a part of it again. He saw Kenji, the potter, closing up his workshop for the day. Kenji saw him, and his eyes widened in surprise. He started to walk toward Kaito, a look of concern on his face. "Kaito, you are back. Where have you been? We were worried." Kaito smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "I have been on a journey," he said simply. "I went to the mountain to learn how to carry some heavy stones." Kenji looked at him closely. He saw the change. The haunted, distant look in Kaito's eyes was gone. The slump in his shoulders had vanished. He stood taller, his presence calm and grounded. "And did you learn?" the potter asked. "Yes," Kaito said. "I learned that the best way to carry them is to put them down." He continued on to his own small house. It was
Just as he had left it, covered in a thin layer of dust, silent and waiting. He slid open the door to his workshop. The air was stale. The light was dim. The unfinished carvings sat on the shelves, mute witnesses to his past despair. The wounded fox was still on his workbench. He did not feel a rush of sadness or shame. He felt only a quiet compassion for the man who had worked here, for the pain he had been in. He picked up the scarred fox. He ran his thumb over the ugly gouge his trembling hand had made. He did not see it as a ruin anymore. He saw it as a part of the object's story, a scar, a memory of a difficult time. He spent the rest of the evening cleaning. He swept the floors, wiped the dust from his tools, and opened the windows to let the fresh, cold evening air circulate. He was not just cleaning a room. He was preparing a space, making it ready for a new beginning. He was emptying the cup. When he was finished, he sat on his stool in the clean, quiet workshop, the piece of cherry wood in his hands. He did not need to begin carving tonight. There was no hurry. For now, it was enough to just sit, to be still, and to listen to the silence. The fire on the mountain had burned away the past. Now, here in the quiet of his own workshop, he could feel the warmth of the future, a small, steady ember, glowing with a quiet and beautiful promise. The Dance of Ash and Embers. In the days that followed, Kaito did not immediately pick up a chisel. The piece of cherry wood sat on his workbench, a quiet and patient companion. He spent his time reacquainting himself with the rhythms of his own life, but through a new lens. He woke with the sun, not because he had to, but because the light felt like a welcome invitation. He would slide open his paper screens and watch the morning mist burn off the nearby fields, seeing not a gray, melancholy veil, but a soft, transformative blanket, a daily ritual of revealing the world. His morning tea was no longer a hollow routine. It was a practice. He would heat the water, listening to the whisper of the iron kettle. He would measure the leaves, admiring their dark, twisted shapes. He would pour the water, watching the leaves unfurl and release their color and fragrance. He would hold the warm cup in his hands and feel its simple, grounding presence. Each step was a universe, just as his father had told him. He was finally able to inhabit that universe, to find the profound peace in the utterly ordinary. He began to work in his small garden, a patch of earth he had neglected for over a year. It was overgrown with weeds, the soil hard and compacted. He worked with the same patient, focused energy he had learned from Ryokan in the temple garden. He did not see it as a battle against the weeds, but as a gentle persuasion of the earth. He loosened the soil, feeling its cool, crumbly texture in his hands. He pulled the weeds, observing their intricate root systems. He found a strange beauty in their tenacity, their will to live. He was not destroying them. He was simply making space for other things to grow. As he worked, his neighbors would pass by. At first, they were hesitant, unsure how to approach the man who had been a ghost in their midst for so long. But Kaito's calm, open demeanor was a quiet invitation. He would look up from his work, his face no longer a mask of sorrow, and offer a simple, genuine greeting. He did not try to explain his absence or his transformation. He just was, and people responded to that simple presence. Kenji the potter came by one afternoon, his hands, as always, dusted with dry clay. He leaned on the low bamboo fence, watching Kaito transplant a small maple sapling. "It is good to see you with your hands in the earth again," Kenji said. "The earth is a good teacher," Kaito replied, gently tamping the soil around the sapling's roots. "It teaches patience, and it does not hold a grudge if you neglect it for a while. It is always ready to begin again." Kenji nodded, understanding the deeper meaning of Kaito's words. "I am firing my kiln tonight," he said. "The big one. A whole month's work. Would you like to come and watch? The nights are cold. The fire is warm." Kaito looked up, his hands covered in dark, rich soil. An image flashed in his mind. The glowing brazier in the temple hall, the creeping orange line of fire consuming his written words. The swirling cloud of ash rising into the blue sky. The gift of fire. "I would like that very much," he said. That night, Kaito walked to Kenji's workshop on the other side of the village. The kiln, a massive, earth-covered structure that looked like a sleeping dragon, was already radiating a powerful heat. A deep orange glow emanated from the stokehole at its base, and a low, hungry roar came from within. Kenji was there, his face ruddy in the firelight, his usual broad smile replaced by an expression of intense, focused concentration. Firing the kiln was the most critical and dangerous part of a potter's work. A mistaken temperature, a moment of inattention, could reduce a month of careful, creative labor to a pile of cracked and worthless shards. Kaito did not speak, sensing that this was a sacred time, a ceremony. He found a spot to sit on a low wooden bench, a respectful distance from the kiln, and simply watched. Kenji moved with a practiced rhythmic grace. He would check the color of the flame through a small spy hole, his experienced eye reading the temperature of the inferno within. He would then take long pieces of split pine and feed them into the stokehole, a careful offering to the fire god that lived inside the kiln. Each time he opened the small iron door, a wave of incandescent heat would wash over the yard, and a shower of golden sparks would fly up into the dark night sky. Kaito watched the sparks. He watched them dance and swirl in the rising heat. Chaotic, joyful ballet of light. They were so bright, so intensely alive for their brief moment of existence, and then they would cool, fade, and vanish back into the darkness. They were like thoughts, he mused, like feelings. They arise, burn brightly, and then, if you let them, they pass. It is only when you try to catch them, to hold on to them, that you get burned. He thought about the dance of ash and embers he had witnessed in the temple. His own story, his own pain, had been like the wood Kenji was feeding into the fire. It had been solid, heavy, dense with memory. The fire had consumed it, broken it down, and in the process released its energy as heat and light. The sparks flying into the night sky were the last joyful cries of that released energy. And what would remain in the morning, after the fire had died? Ash. And inside the kiln, if all went well, the pots, transformed. The soft, pliable clay would be made hard, permanent, beautiful, and useful by its trial in the fire. The glaze, a dull, chalky powder, would be melted into a liquid glass, a coat of shining, vibrant color. He understood in that moment that he was one of Kenji's pots. He had been shaped by the hands of his life, by his father's love, by his own skill. But he had been soft, vulnerable, unfinished. His grief, his journey to the mountain, his long night of writing, that had been the fire. It had been a terrifying, all-consuming inferno. He had felt at times that it would shatter him. But it had not. It had transformed him. It had made him stronger. It had melted the dull glaze of his sorrow into something clear and shining. The night wore on. The moon rose, casting long, soft shadows. Other villagers, friends of Kenji, came to sit and watch, to offer their quiet support. They brought flasks of warm sake and shared them, their voices low and respectful. Kaito accepted a small cup. The warm liquid spread through his chest, a gentle, pleasant heat. He felt a sense of community, of shared humanity that he had not felt in a very long time. These people understood the fire. They lived by the rhythms of planting and harvest, of birth and death. They knew that transformation often required a trial by fire. In the deepest hours of the night, Kenji began the final, most intense stage of the firing. He began to feed the wood into the kiln at a much faster rate. The roar from within intensified, and the glow from the stokehold turned from a deep orange to an almost white-hot incandescence. The heat was so intense now that Kaito could feel it on his face from across the yard. "He is pushing it to the peak," an old farmer sitting next to Kaito whispered. "This is where the magic happens. This is where the clay becomes stone." Kaito watched, mesmerized. This was the crucible. This was the moment of complete surrender. Kenji was giving everything to the fire, holding nothing back, and Kaito recognized this moment from his own journey. It was the moment he had picked up the brush, the moment he had touched the first page to the coal. It was the point of no return, the leap of faith into the heart of the flame. Finally, Kenji slammed the iron door shut and sealed it with wet clay. The roaring subsided, replaced by a deep, resonant humming, the sound of 1,000,000 atoms settling into a new and permanent alignment. The work was done. Now, all that was left was the long, slow cooling. The outcome was out of the potter's hands. He had to trust the process. He had to trust the fire. Kenji came over to the bench, his face streaked with soot, his body dripping with sweat, but his eyes were shining with a deep, calm satisfaction. He sat down heavily next to Kaito and let out a long, slow breath. "Now we wait," he said, his voice hoarse. "The rest is up to the kiln gods." "Your work was beautiful, Kenji," Kaito said, and he meant it. He had not just seen a man feeding a fire. He had witnessed an artist in deep conversation with the most powerful and unpredictable of elements. Kenji smiled, a tired, grateful smile. "It is a good fire," he said. "It feels right." He looked over at Kaito, his gaze direct in the flickering firelight. "You have a fire in you too, my friend. I saw it when you came back from the mountain. The old, smoky, smoldering fire is gone. This one is clear and bright. It is the fire of a craftsman who is ready to work." Kaito looked down at his own hands, resting in his lap. He felt a warmth in them, a quiet, steady energy. Kenji was right. The fire had not just been a destructive force. It had been a creative one. It had burned away the dead wood, and now, from the ashes, something new was ready to grow. He walked home under a canopy of brilliant, cold stars. The world was asleep, silent. He felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of rightness. He had seen the great cycle in action. The wood becomes fire. The fire transforms the clay. The clay becomes a vessel to hold water and nourish life. Nothing is lost. Everything is transformed. He entered his workshop. The piece of cherry wood was sitting on his bench, bathed in the soft, silvery moonlight streaming through the window. It seemed to be glowing, humming with its own quiet energy. He picked it up. He held it in his hands. He no longer felt any hesitation, any fear. He felt only a deep, quiet readiness. He reached for his favorite chisel, the one with the handle worn smooth by his father's hand, and then his own. He picked up a small wooden mallet. He did not need to think. He did not need to plan. He had listened to the wood. He had been through the fire. He knew what he needed to do. He placed the sharp edge of the chisel against the rough bark of the cherry branch, and with a soft, decisive tap of the mallet, he made the first cut. The sound was clean and clear in the silent workshop. It was the sound of a new beginning. It was the sound of a story, not of ash and embers, but of the beautiful, useful thing that can be born from them. The first chip of wood fell away, landing softly on the workbench. It was a small, almost insignificant curl of bark and pale sapwood. But to Kaito, it was a momentous event. It was the first act of creation he had performed in over a year. The first time he had imposed his will upon a piece of wood, not with frustration or despair, but with a clear and quiet intention. The separation of that first chip felt like a release, a breaking of a long and sorrowful fast. He did not rush. The lessons of the temple were etched deep within him now. He worked with the same meditative rhythm he had applied to sweeping leaves and chopping wood. Each tap of the mallet was synchronized with his breath. Inhale as he positioned the chisel, feeling for the perfect angle, the perfect entry point into the wood's story. Exhale as he tapped, a short, sharp release of air and energy. The sound became a mantra, a steady, patient percussion in the moonlit silence. Tap, tap, tap. His mind, once a raging river of chaotic thoughts, was as still and clear as a mountain lake at dawn. He was not thinking about what the final form would be. He was not worried about making a mistake. He was simply present with the process. His entire awareness focused on the tiny point where steel met wood. He could feel the grain of the cherry wood through the chisel, the subtle shifts in its density, the path of least resistance. He was not forcing the wood to bend to his vision. He was in a dialogue with it, a partnership. He would make a cut, and the wood would respond, revealing a new facet, a new curve, suggesting the next move. He worked through the night, not from a place of frantic energy, but from a deep, calm well of focus. The moon traced its slow arc across the sky, its light moving across his workshop floor, illuminating different corners of the room, different tools, different memories. He was aware of its passage, but untroubled by it. Time had become fluid, a gentle current carrying him along. As he worked, the rough, gnarled branch began to shed its outer skin, the form that had been sleeping within, the form he had sensed when Soko first placed the wood in his hand, began to emerge. It was not a grand or complex shape. It was simple, humble, the gentle, upward curve of a new moon, the soft, rounded belly of a sleeping bird, the smooth, polished feel of a worry stone. It was a shape that spoke not of drama or power, but of peace. He began to recognize the feeling that was flowing from his heart, through his arm, and into the tool. It was not skill, not technique, not ambition. It was compassion. He was carving with a deep sense of tenderness, both for the wood and for himself. Each smooth curve he created was an act of kindness. Each rough edge he sanded away was an act of forgiveness. He was not just carving a piece of wood, he was giving physical form to the healing that had taken place within him. The wood was a mirror, and
In it, he was seeing his own transformed soul. He remembered the scarred fox, the carving he had ruined in his moment of despair. He had seen it then as a symbol of his own brokenness. Now he understood that even that act had been a necessary part of his journey. The scar was a character in his story, a mark on the page that gave the subsequent silence its meaning. Without the brokenness, he could not have understood wholeness. Without the noise, he could not have appreciated the peace. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter into the workshop, he knew the work was nearly finished. The form was there, complete and balanced. All that was left was the final polishing. He put down his chisels and took up a handful of fine sand, and then a soft, worn piece of cloth. He began to rub the wood, his movements slow and circular. The friction created a gentle warmth. This final stage was the most intimate. There were no more sharp tools, no more forceful removals of material. There was only the gentle, persistent pressure of his own hands. As he polished, the wood's true character was revealed. The subtle, swirling patterns of the grain, which had been muted, began to glow with a deep inner light. The color of the cherry wood deepened from a pale pink to a rich, warm sienna. The surface, once rough, became as smooth and lustrous as polished stone. It felt warm and alive in his hands, a small, solid vessel of peace. He held it up in the morning light. It was a simple, abstract form fitting perfectly in the palm of his hand. It had no name, no function other than to be what it was, a piece of wood that had been listened to, a shape that had been released from its slumber. It was a tangible piece of silence. It was the feeling of the temple garden, the memory of the master's tea, the echo of the final ash disappearing into the wind. He sat there, holding the finished piece, a feeling of deep, quiet satisfaction washing over him. It was not the proud, ego-driven satisfaction of a young artist who has created something impressive. It was the humble, grateful contentment of a craftsman who has been allowed to participate in a small act of creation,
to bring a little bit of quiet beauty into the world. Later that morning, he walked back to Kenji's kiln. A small crowd had gathered. The kiln, after cooling all night, was ready to be opened. This was the moment of truth. The air was thick with a mixture of hope and anxiety. Kenji, his face clean but etched with fatigue, took a heavy hammer and knocked away the clay seal. With the help of another man, he pulled open the heavy, bricked-up door. A wave of residual heat, smelling of baked earth and minerals, washed out. For a moment, no one spoke. They peered into the dark, cavernous interior. Then, Kenji reached in with a long metal hook and carefully drew out the first piece. It was a large platter. He held it up to the light. A collective sigh of relief and admiration went through the crowd.
It was perfect. The glaze, which had been a dull gray, was now a stunning, deep cobalt blue, with subtle crystalline patterns that looked like a constellation of stars. The fire had worked its magic. One by one, Kenji and his helpers unloaded the kiln. There were bowls, vases, teacups, and plates. Each one was a small miracle, a unique individual born of earth and fire. There were a few casualties, a small vase with a crack, a cup whose glaze had run, but these were accepted as part of the process, the small price the fire god demanded for its gifts. The overwhelming majority of the pieces were beautiful, transformed, their colors more vibrant and their forms more solid than Kaito could have imagined. He watched, feeling a deep kinship with the potter. They were engaged in the same work, he and Kenji. They were both taking the raw, humble materials of the earth and, through a process of focused attention and a trial by fire, transforming them into objects of beauty and use. Kenji saw him and smiled, a broad, triumphant grin. He held up a small, perfectly formed tea bowl. The glaze was the color of a winter dawn, a soft, misty gray with hints of lavender and rose. "This one," he said, his voice full of pride, "this one is for you, a gift from the fire." Kaito accepted the bowl. It was still warm. He held it in his hands, feeling its perfect weight, its smooth, glassy surface. It was an object of profound and simple beauty. He reached into his own sleeve and took out the piece of polished cherry wood. He offered it to Kenji. "And this," Kaito said, "is a gift from the silence." Kenji took the small sculpture. He turned it over in his large, clay-caked hands, his potter's fingers immediately sensitive to its form and texture. He closed his eyes, his expression softening. He felt the peace in it, the quiet story it told. He opened his eyes and looked at Kaito, a look of deep, mutual respect passing between the two craftsmen. "Ah," Kenji said, his voice soft with understanding. "So, you have been firing a kiln of your own?" Kaito nodded. He looked from the bowl in his hands to the wood in Kenji's. Earth and fire. Wood and silence. Two different paths, two different materials, but both had led to the same place. A quiet, simple piece of beauty, held in the palm of a hand. The dance of ash and embers was over, and this, he thought, this is what remains. Part 9. The sky after the smoke clears. Kaito's life settled into a new and gentle rhythm, one that blended the quiet discipline of the temple with the familiar patterns of his village. The workshop, once a place of torment, became his sanctuary. It was no longer a space for ambition or the desperate need to prove himself, but a place for quiet conversation. His relationship with his tools and his materials had been fundamentally transformed. He no longer saw a block of wood as a challenge to be conquered, but as a partner in a slow, patient dance.
He would begin each day not by immediately starting work, but by sitting. He would sit on his stool in the quiet morning light, holding the tea bowl Kenji had given him. He would drink his tea and simply be present in the space. He would listen to the sounds of the village waking up, the distant crow of a rooster, the rumble of a farmer's cart, the laughter of children on their way to the stream. He would feel the air, smell the scent of the wood shavings and the earth from his garden. This period of quiet sitting was the foundation upon which the day's work was built. It was the act of clearing the sky before the sun could truly shine. When he did begin to work, it was with a quality of attention that was both relaxed and intensely focused. He worked on small, simple things. He did not attempt any more grand dragons or fierce samurai. Instead, he carved things that he could hold in the palm of his hand. A smooth, polished seed pod, its form suggesting the promise of new life. The delicate, curled form of a fern frond, a perfect spiral of growth. A series of small, smooth stones, each one with a slightly different shape and balance that could be held and turned over in the hand, a physical anchor for a restless mind. His work was no longer about creating a likeness of a thing, but about capturing its essence, its spirit. When he carved a bird, he was not just trying to replicate its feathers and form. He was trying to capture the feeling of flight, the lightness, the freedom. His carvings became less detailed, more suggestive. He left more to the imagination of the person who would hold them. He was learning to appreciate the power of the uncarven wood, the silence between the cuts. People in the village began to notice. They would stop by his workshop, drawn in by the quiet, peaceful atmosphere that now emanated from it. They would watch him work, mesmerized by the calm, steady rhythm of his hands. He did not try to sell his work, but sometimes, if someone seemed particularly drawn to a piece, he would simply pick it up and place it in their hands. A gift from the wood, he would say. An old woman whose hands were gnarled with arthritis and whose heart was heavy with the recent loss of her husband came by one day. She watched him as he polished a small, smooth piece of camphor wood shaped like a water droplet. She said nothing, but he could feel the deep, quiet sorrow she carried. When he was finished, he held it out to her. She took it, her trembling fingers closing around its warmth and smoothness. A tear rolled down her wrinkled cheek. She did not say thank you in words, but her eyes conveyed a gratitude so profound it needed no sound. He knew that the small piece of wood would not take away her grief, but it might serve as a small, solid anchor in her storm, a quiet reminder that even after the greatest sorrow, smoothness and peace can still be found. He had, he realized, become a different kind of craftsman. His father had been a master of form, of technique, of tradition. His work had been admired for its incredible skill and lifelike detail. Kaito understood now that his own path was different. His work was not about astonishing the eye, but about calming the heart. His carvings were not statements. They were invitations to stillness. He was not carving objects. He was carving moments of peace. One afternoon, as he was sweeping the wood shavings from his floor, he found himself thinking of Master Ryokan. He thought of the master's simple, profound wisdom. He had not offered Kaito grand philosophies or complex doctrines. He had offered him a broom, a weeding stick, a blank page,
and a single glowing coal. He had taught Kaito that enlightenment was not to be found in a bolt of lightning from the heavens, but in the patient, mindful execution of the simplest of tasks. Peace was not a destination to be reached, but a way of walking. Kaito put down his broom and went to his workbench. He selected a piece of old weathered pine, a piece that had been part of a temple being long ago. It was a humble piece of wood, full of cracks and imperfections, but it had a deep, quiet spirit. He began to carve. He did not have a specific image in his mind, but he held the feeling of ryokan in his heart, the calm, the gentle humor, the deep, unwavering presence. He worked for many days. The form that emerged was that of a small, wizened old man. His back bent, his robe simple and patched. He was not an imposing godlike figure. He was a simple, humble man. In one hand he held a single perfect lotus blossom. His face was the most difficult part. Kaito did not try to capture a physical likeness of ryokan. Instead, he tried to carve the master's expression. He carved the deep lines of a long life, but he also carved a profound sense of peace. He carved eyes that were not looking out at the world with judgment, but seemed to be looking inward, at a source of endless stillness. And at the corners of the mouth, he carved the faintest hint of a smile. The gentle, compassionate smile that understood the great cosmic joke of human suffering. When it was finished, it was the finest thing he had ever made. Not because of its technical perfection, it was, in fact, quite rustic and simple, but because it was filled with a genuine spirit. It was a carving born not of ambition, but of gratitude. He wrapped it carefully in a soft cloth and knew that he had to make one more journey up the mountain. The walk was different this time. He was not a desperate seeker climbing toward a distant hope. He was a pilgrim, making a journey of thanks. He noticed things he had missed before, even on his descent. The way the light changed as he gained altitude, the different types of moss that grew on the north and south sides of the trees. He felt the mountain not as an obstacle to be overcome, but as an old familiar friend. He walked with a light step, his heart full and quiet. When he arrived at the temple gate, Soko was there, raking the gravel courtyard into its familiar wave-like patterns. He looked up as Kaito approached, and a slow, warm smile spread across his face. "The axe has been quiet," Soko said, "but the mountain has heard the sound of a different tool." Kaito smiled in return. "I have brought a gift," he said, "for the master." Soko led him to the small enclosed garden. Ryokan was there, just as Kaito had first seen him, sitting on a cushion, looking out at the single pine tree and the mossy stones. He was older now, Kaito thought, and even more transparent, as if the world were beginning to shine right through him. Kaito knelt and placed the wrapped object before the master. Ryokan looked at him, his eyes as clear and present as ever. "A gift?" he said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "The only gift is this moment, and it is already here. It does not need to be wrapped in cloth." "Nevertheless," Kaito said, his voice soft. He gently unwrapped the carving and placed it on the tatami mat. Ryokan leaned forward. His old eyes studied the small wooden figure. He looked at the bent back, the patched robes, the lotus blossom.
He looked at the serene, smiling face. He was silent for a very long time. The only sound was the wind in the pine tree outside. Finally, he reached out a wrinkled, trembling hand and touched the carving. He did not touch it as a critic, examining its form. He touched it as one would touch the face of a friend. "So," Ryokan said, a deep chuckle rumbling in his chest. "This is how you see me, a grumpy old man with a flower." "I see a man who taught me that the sky is still there, even after the smoke has cleared," Kaito said. Ryokan picked up the carving, his movements slow and careful. He held it in his lap. "This is a fine piece of work, Kaito. The wood has spoken very clearly through your hands, but you are mistaken about one thing. Master, I did not teach you that the sky is still there," Ryokan said, his gaze meeting Kaito's. "You knew it all along. We are all born knowing it. We are born with a vast, clear sky inside us, but then we start to build fires. Fires of desire, of anger, of fear, of grief. We create so much smoke that we forget the sky is there. We think the smoke is the sky. We think our suffering is our true nature." He gestured with the carving toward the world outside. "My work is not to show you the sky. My work is only to show you the smoke, to help you see that the smoke is not you. It is just something that is passing through. The writing, the fire, that was all just a way for you to see your own smoke, to understand its nature, so that you could finally let it go and see what has been here all along." He placed the carving back on the mat. "You do not need me anymore, Kaito. You have seen your own sky. Now, your work is to live under it, to remember its clarity, even when new clouds gather, as they always will. The smoke clears, but the fires of life will be lit again. Do not be afraid of them. You know their nature now. You know that they too shall pass. And you know that no matter how thick the smoke, the clear blue sky is always, always there, waiting patiently." The master's words were the final, perfect gift. It was the gift of his own freedom. He had not come to the temple to become a disciple of Ryokan. He had come to the temple to become a master of himself. Ryokan had not given him the truth. He had helped him uncover his own. Kaito bowed, a deep, long bow that came from the very center of his being. It was a bow of gratitude, of respect, and of farewell. When he rose, he felt a profound and final sense of lightness. The last subtle attachment, the attachment to his own teacher, his own savior, had been released. He walked away from the temple for the last time, his heart not heavy with the sorrow of parting, but light with the joy of a new and unburdened beginning. He walked down the mountain not as a student, but as a man, a carver, a quiet inhabitant of the clear blue sky. The smoke was gone, the air was clean, and the whole world was shining. As he descended the mountain path, Kaito noticed the world with an even deeper clarity. The master's final teaching resonated, not as an abstract idea, but as a living, breathing reality all around him. He looked up through the canopy of the ancient cedars. He could see patches of the brilliant blue sky, framed by the dark green of the branches. He understood what Ryokan meant. The sky was the constant. The branches and leaves were the transient forms that appeared against it. His life was the sky. His thoughts, his feelings, his stories, they were the leaves. They grew, They flourished, they fell, they became part of the earth again. But the sky remained. He felt a profound shift in his perception of time. Before, his life had felt like a narrow, linear path leading from a painful past toward an uncertain future. He was always walking away from one and toward the other. Now he felt time as a vast, open space, like the sky itself. The past was not a place he had left behind. It was a cloud that had drifted through his sky. The future was not a destination he was striving for. It was the open, unknown expanse of blue that lay ahead. All that was truly real was the present moment, this single step on the path, this single breath of cold, clean air. This understanding brought with it a deep sense of relaxation. He was no longer in a hurry. He was no longer trying to get somewhere else, to become someone else. He was already here. He was already himself. The great, striving effort that had defined his life, first the striving for artistic mastery, then the striving for an escape from grief, had fallen away. In its place was a simple, quiet acceptance of what is. When he reached the foothills, the sun was beginning to set, painting the western sky in fiery strokes of orange, pink, and gold. He stopped and watched. It was a spectacular, dramatic display. Another kind of fire, another kind of smoke. But he saw it differently now. He did not cling to it, wishing it would last forever. He did not feel sad that its beauty was so fleeting. He simply watched it, appreciated it for what it was, a beautiful, transient display against the deepening blue of the evening sky. He knew that the fire would fade, the colors would soften, and the sky would reveal its true, dark, star-filled nature. The drama was beautiful, but the peace that followed was just as profound. He saw his own life in that sunset, his great grief, his intense journey. It had been a fiery, dramatic sunset, and now he was entering the quiet, star-filled peace of the night that follows. He arrived back in his village as true darkness fell. Lanterns were beginning to glow in the windows of the houses, small, warm points of light. He walked, not to his own home, but to the small cemetery on the edge of the village, a place he had avoided for over a year. It was situated in a quiet grove of bamboo, and the wind made a soft, rustling music as it moved through the tall, slender stalks. He found his parents' graves, two simple, moss-covered stones standing side by side. He knelt before them. He had no grand speeches to make, no desperate pleas for forgiveness. He had already said everything that needed to be said to the paper, and had given it all to the fire. He simply knelt. He placed his hands on the cool, damp earth. He felt the solidity of the ground beneath him. He listened to the whispering of the bamboo. He felt a sense of connection to his parents that was deeper and more real than anything he had felt in his grief. They were not ghosts haunting him. They were the earth beneath his hands. They were the air he was breathing. They were the quiet strength that had carried him up the mountain. Their love was not a memory to be mourned. It was a living presence, a constant sky that had been there all along. "I am home," he whispered, to them and to himself. He stayed there for a long time, not in sorrow, but in a state of quiet, peaceful communion. The smoke had finally, truly, cleared from this place as well. In the weeks and months that followed, Kaito's workshop became a quiet center of gravity in the village, not because he was famous or producing grand works, but because of the palpable sense of peace that resided there. People would come, not always to look at his carvings, but just to sit. A farmer might stop by after a long day in the fields, a mother with a sleeping baby on her back, a child who was feeling sad. They would sit on the bench outside his open door, and Kaito would continue his work, the soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap of his mallet, a soothing, meditative sound. He would offer them tea, and they would sit together in a comfortable silence, watching the wood shavings fall, watching the light change. People left his workshop feeling calmer, more centered, as if some of the stillness of the place had soaked into them. He continued to give his work away. He gave a carving of a small, patient turtle to a young man who was struggling with impatience. He gave a carving of a smooth, resilient river stone to a woman who was going through a difficult illness. He gave a carving of a tiny, sleeping seed to a couple who were expecting their first child. His art had become a form of practice, a way of sharing the peace he had found. Each piece was a small, silent sermon on the beauty of the present moment. One day, Kenji the potter came to him with a troubled look on his face. A special commission for a wealthy patron, a set of 12 delicate sake cups, had gone wrong. A mishap in the glazing had left them with small web-like cracks on their surface. They were still functional, but they were no longer perfect. Kenji was distraught, ready to smash them and start over. Kaito took one of the cups in his hands. He looked at the fine network of cracks. He did not see a flaw. He saw a story. He saw the mark of the fire, the unique, unrepeatable pattern of a difficult journey. "Do not smash them, Kenji," he said. "They are not ruined. They are more beautiful now." He took the cups back to his workshop. He carefully ground some gold into a fine powder and mixed it with lacquer. Then, with a tiny, delicate brush, he traced every crack on every cup with a fine line of gold. The process took him days. It required immense patience and a perfectly steady hand. He was not hiding the cracks. He was illuminating them. He was celebrating them, turning what had been seen as a flaw into the most beautiful feature of the object. When he was finished, the cups were breathtaking. They were no longer a set of identical, perfect objects. They were a family of 12 unique individuals, each with its own golden map of its history. The cracks were not scars of failure, but veins of gold, testaments to their resilience. He gave them back to Kenji, who stared at them speechless. The potter understood immediately. He was looking at the physical embodiment of a profound truth, that the things that break us can, in the healing, make us more beautiful, more valuable, more unique. This, Kaito realized, was the final clearing of the smoke. It was one thing to find peace in solitude on a remote mountaintop. It was another thing entirely to live that peace in the midst of the world, to find the beauty in the imperfections, to see the sky through the clouds, and to help others do the same. His grief had cracked him just like the cups. His journey, his writing, his fire, that had been the gold. He was not the man he had been before his sorrow. He was someone new, someone stronger, more compassionate, and more beautiful for having been broken. The sky was not just clear. It was veined with the golden light of the dawn that follows the darkest night. Part 10. The sound of a single flute in the quiet night. The seasons turned, not as a series of dramatic events, but as a slow, gentle breathing of the land around the village. Winter snow would melt into the soft, damp earth of spring. Spring's vibrant green would deepen into the lush, heavy canopy of summer. Summer's heat would give way to the crisp air and brilliant colors of autumn, which in turn would surrender to the quiet white sleep of winter once more. Year after year, this silent, graceful cycle repeated, and Kaito's life flowed with it. He was no longer a young man. The lines on his face, once carved by grief, had softened into a map of quiet contentment. His hair was threaded with silver, and his movements had the slow, deliberate grace of a man who is in no hurry, a man who has learned that everything arrives in its own perfect time. His workshop had become a landmark in the village, a place known not for the fame of its craftsmen, but for the profound sense of peace that seemed to soak into its very timbers. He still carved every day, his hands now wrinkled and knowing, still spoke the silent language of the wood. His pieces were sought after, not as decorations, but as companions. People would say that to hold a piece of Kaito's work was to hold a small piece of the mountain's stillness, a tangible reminder of the clear sky that waits behind the clouds. In the evenings, after the work of the day was done and the village had settled into the deep quiet of the night, Kaito would often take out his father's old bamboo flute. It was a simple instrument, dark and smooth with age, its surface polished by the hands of 2 generations. He had not been able to touch it during his years of sorrow, for its sound had been too full of painful memories. But now, it was just a flute, a hollow piece of bamboo waiting for a breath to give it a voice. He would sit on the edge of his veranda, the cool night air on his face, and he would play. He was not a master musician. He did not play intricate melodies or famous songs. He played simple, long, clear notes that seemed to rise up from the earth and dissolve into the vast, star-dusted sky. His music was a conversation with the night. It was the sound of his own breath, slow and steady, given a voice by the bamboo. It was a single thread of sound, weaving itself into the great silent tapestry of the darkness. The music was not happy, nor was it sad. It was like the sound of the wind in the pines, or the cry of a distant night bird. It was the sound of what is. One such night, as a sliver of a moon hung in the sky, a young traveler arrived in the village. He was weary, his clothes were dusty from a long road, and his shoulders were hunched against a cold that he carried inside him. His mind was a noisy, crowded place, full of worries about the future and regrets about the past. He sought lodging for the night, but his heart sought something more. A moment of quiet, a respite from the relentless turmoil of his own thoughts. As he walked through the sleeping village, a sound reached him. It was a faint, lonely sound, a single, clear note from a flute that seemed to be coming from the edge of the village. The sound did not demand his attention. It simply was. And there was something in its pure, unadorned quality that cut through the noise in his own mind. It was a sound of such profound peace that it seemed to call to the part of him that yearned for that same peace. He found himself walking toward it, drawn by that single thread of sound. He came to a small, dark workshop. The paper screens were open to the night, and in the soft glow of a single oil lamp, he could see the silhouette of a man sitting on the veranda, playing a flute. The traveler stood in the shadows, not wanting to intrude. He just listened. Each note that emerged from the flute was like a smooth, cool stone dropped into the churning waters of his mind. The ripples spread out, and the water grew still. He could feel the tight knot of anxiety in his chest begin to loosen. He could feel his own breath, which had been shallow and quick, begin to deepen, to slow, to match the long, calm notes of the flute. After a time, the music stopped. The last note hung in the air for a long moment, and then it was gone, absorbed back into the great silence. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, vibrant, alive. It was the silence the music had been pointing to all along. Kaito lowered the flute from his lips. He had been aware of the traveler's presence for some time, but he had not stopped playing. Now he turned his head and looked out into the darkness. "The night is cold," he said, his voice calm and gentle. "The tea is still warm. Come, sit."
The young traveler, startled but grateful, stepped into the light. He felt awkward and clumsy in the presence of this calm, centered man. He sat on the edge of the veranda, and Kaito went inside, returning with a simple earthenware cup filled with tea. The traveler wrapped his cold hands around its warmth. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Your music, it is very beautiful." "It is not my music," Kaito said softly. "It is the sound of the night. The bamboo and my breath are just borrowing it for a moment." They sat in a comfortable silence. The traveler's eyes adjusted to the lamplight, and he looked around the workshop. He saw the tools neatly arranged on the walls. He saw the piles of wood shavings curled like sleeping animals on the floor, and he saw the finished carvings sitting on a low shelf. His gaze was drawn to one piece in particular. It was a small wooden fox, curled in a sleeping ball. It was a beautiful, peaceful object, but what made it extraordinary was the network of fine, golden lines that traced across its back, shimmering in the lamplight. "What is this?" the traveler asked, gesturing toward the fox. Kaito picked it up and placed it in the young man's hands. "That is a very old story," he said. "The wood was wounded a long time ago. It was broken." The traveler ran his thumb over the golden lines. They were not rough. They were perfectly smooth, a seamless part of the whole. But the gold? "The wound is where the light enters," Kaito said. "The break is not something to be hidden. It is a part of the fox's history. The gold does not erase the break, it honors it. It makes the fox more beautiful for having been broken." The young man looked down at the small carving in his hands, and he felt a profound sense of recognition. He saw his own wounds, his own broken places, his own inner chaos, and for the first time he saw them not as sources of shame, but as potential veins of gold. He looked up at Kaito, his eyes full of a new, fragile hope. "The music you were playing," the traveler said, his voice quiet. "It sounded sad, but it also sounded peaceful." "Did it?" Kaito replied, a gentle smile touching his lips. "Perhaps that is because sadness and peace can live in the same house. They are not enemies. The sadness is a cloud. The peace is the sky. The cloud passes. The sky remains." He raised the flute. "When I play, I am not trying to tell a story of sadness or of joy. I am just breathing. And when you can listen to your own breath, you will hear the same song. It is the quietest music in the world, and it is always playing." Kaito showed the traveler to a small, empty room at the back of his house, where a clean futon was laid out. "Rest here," he said. "The road will be there in the morning." The young man lay down. The noise in his mind had not vanished completely, but it was a distant murmur now, not a deafening roar. He could hear the sound of the wind in the bamboo outside. He could feel the steady, quiet rhythm of his own breathing. He held the memory of the golden fox in his mind and the master's words. "The wound is where the light enters." He closed his eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, he felt the gentle, welcome approach of a deep and peaceful sleep. Kaito sat on his veranda for a while longer, alone in the quiet night. The moon had set, and the stars were a brilliant scattered dust of diamonds against a black velvet cloth. He did not play the flute again. There was no need. The music was in the silence itself. He had come so far from the young man who lay awake, crushed by the weight of unseen stones. The stones had not vanished. They had been written. They had been burned. They had been turned to ash and given to the wind. They had become part of the soil, part of the mountain, part of the sky. They had been transformed, and in their transformation, they had transformed him. The smoke has cleared. The sky is vast and quiet. And under the calm, watchful eyes of the stars, there is only this: the feeling of the cool night air, the scent of wood and earth, the steady, gentle rhythm of a single, peaceful breath. In and out. A quiet body resting in a quiet house, in a quiet village, under a quiet sky. There is nothing to do. There is nowhere to go. There is only the soft, deep darkness and the gentle, silent invitation to rest, to let go, to sleep.